The dwarf instantly made his way back towards the mound of gems, but then he frowned and stopped. He returned to his desk, unwrapped the portrait, and examined it for a little over 10 more minutes before he stowed it away into a smaller cabinet after some hesitation. The small cabinet had the same kind of things, but there were only 5 items here. He put the art piece in second place. The difference between the 2 cabinets was that the ones in this one would soon be handed to the legendary mage for perusal, while the others would be thrown out like trash over the next few months. Summer passed in the blink of an eye for Richard. The next day was already the autumn festival, marking the beginning of autumn where fish could no longer be found in Flow Bay. Millions of people living nearby would hold a grand celebration on this day, expressing gratitude to the god of the sea for granting them the food to survive the long winter. The Deep Blue, located right next to Flow Bay, commenced autumn with this festival. Of course, that was all meaningless to Richard. All his time was spent either completing the heaps upon heaps of assignments he had, or meditating and practicing magic to increase his mana. He wished to fill up the entirety of his time. If he didn't, wild thoughts would bubble up in his mind that were hard to get rid of. Aaron reached his place on time the night before the festival. She already found it hard to carry the box with his dinner in one hand now, and one could imagine how much heavier it would grow in the future. She sat quietly by his side as he ducked between all the food, just watching him eat. At this point the gold had stopped exchanging hands, and the two rarely spoke. Aaron didn't get a single coin from Richard, while eating for the boy had grown completely miserable. No matter how she tried, the young lady couldn't hide the fact that she was troubled, but she refused to tell him why no matter what. It left him with a pain he could not soothe. Richard swallowed the last bit of dessert with great determination before he raised his head to really look at the girl for the first time that day. He wanted to thank her like he usually did, but the string of numbers that appeared on the girl's body made him freeze on the spot. The girl's figure had changed. The minute changes were enhanced in his digital mindscape, the numbers aligning in front of him. Her breasts had grown larger, but they weren't balanced. This wasn't some natural growth, instead due to some external injury. Her position was quite awkward as well, especially her trembling legs that caused her to shift her weight around subtly on occasion. It was like the cotton cushion of the chair was a bed of needles, poking into her down below. Her eyes were a little swollen as well, more red than normal seemingly from her crying just moments ago. Her robe was much thicker this time, wrapped tightly around her, but an accidental movement had exposed a hickey on her neck. Her heartbeat was much faster than usual, faster than his own. In fact, it was so fast that a serious event should have occurred. Adding up all the traces and marks, an immediate answer welled up in Richard's mind, one that he refused to believe. "You slept with someone else?" Richard's voice was dry and husky, so much so that even he couldn't recognize it. At the age of 11 he hadn't known what nobles started to learn at the age of 7 or 8, but in this past half-year this girl in front of him had taken him halfway. He'd already learnt of how males and females could interact. Erin trembled, her face turning white. Yet the truth being out somehow calmed her down, and she raised her hand to tidy up the messy hair by her cheeks. "Yes, last night." Richard took a deep breath and closed his eyes, refusing to see the devastating numbers stacking up in his vision. "Why?" he asked, his voice growing as calm as hers. He had become ice cold. "I need money. I have a lot myself." Ever since Richard started noticing Erin change, he was like a bird breaking out of its shell. He'd started to learn of the outside world, and that he couldn't judge others by his own standard. Take expenses for example. His monthly income would be enough for over 10 people to live a good life in the Deep Blue. Still pale, Erin looked deep into Richard's eyes and shook her head with determination. "But I don't want your money." She cleaned up the thermos box as usual. Walking towards the door, she turned and said, "Oh, I forgot to inform you. Someone else will be delivering your food from tomorrow. So, Richard. See you around." The gate shut slowly with a loud thud, and Richard lost all his energy as he leaned back into his chair. He pulled at his hair, trying to convince himself that nothing had happened just now, but both his abilities and the traits he'd developed in his childhood told him this was cold hard fact. What he couldn't understand was why Aaron didn't want his money. The boy still didn't know that people insisted on things for unknown reasons when they were young, persisting with their emotions as they let go of whatever truly meant something to them. The winter-like summer had just passed. Even early in autumn Flow Bay was freezing cold, no different from the harsh winter. The only way to differentiate was that the colors of the vegetation hadn't faded completely yet. Richard was like a volcano that had been lying dormant for a long time, overflowing with great energy that had suddenly erupted out of nowhere. His craze for knowledge surprised his professors again, and they'd already been dumbstruck by his progress in summer. It was almost unbelievable that someone could do so much in such little time, but this tiny boy was living proof. He'd already tweaked his schedule many times, leaving himself no break to reflect. His schedule had been planned to the second, so whenever his fatigue peaked he just cleared his mind and collapsed on his bed to enter deep sleep instantly. He'd thrown out even the most basic vigilance he'd learnt by living in the mountains, the only way to sleep so soundly that 3 hours would be sufficient to pull him through a day of learning. That was also how his mana gain during sleep was no less than what he would get while meditating. The reports Black Gold received were as abundant as the flakes of snow outside, causing the dwarf to rage. He spared no effort in ensuring as few made it to the legendary mage's desk as possible, just in case Her Excellency grew overly ecstatic and disrupted the already frail balance of expenses and income in the deep blue. However, the Grey Dwarf's powers failed him at times. Written records fluttered to every corner of the deep blue like water gushing out of a geyser, and many of them flew so far that they bypassed him and delivered themselves to Sharon on their own. The finances of the deep blue began to shake with uncertainty once more. Thankfully Duke Solom had made it up to them with a huge support fee out of the blue for some reason, and they'd sold another spot as a paid apprentice to the Millennial Empire, which was one of the 3 major human empires. Although these events covered for autumn and winter, Grey Dwarves didn't lack foresight. Black Gold was very good at financial speculation, and was used to worrying about the Deep Blue's situation 300 years into the future. Now, it looked like they wouldn't be able to make it past spring. The Grey Dwarf grew more haggard as the days went by. Some miracle had thinned his sturdy and stocky frame, making him a little bony. His coat evidently didn't fit him anymore, fluttering slightly in the wind whenever he moved his arms to cast a spell. This was just like the unstable accounts. Black Gold had to deal with a sea of numbers every day. He had a pretty steady income, but his expenses were always hard to estimate. They tended to exceed his funds rather than fall short, which made him upset. Every piece of his profit consumed was like a piece of his flesh gouged out while he was still alive. However, the legendary mage's joy wouldn't be put aside just because of the Grey Dwarf's determination. At times, she would even celebrate the tiniest of Richard's achievements. This autumn, the Grey Dwarf was the only person in the entire Deep Blue who didn't want to see Sharon happy. At his most helpless, he'd even considered embezzling funds from Sharon's personal stores. If Her Excellency deigned to open the slightest crack in her purse, the Deep Blue's finances would be solved with the snap of a finger. He had once been bewitched by this idea. Who knew how many gigantic dragons' worth of wealth Her Excellency had in her exquisite little wallet? However, it was fortunate that he quickly regained his senses and realized how silly his plan was. Even the mighty dragons dared not lay their hands on Sharon's funds. What would a tiny dwarf be able to do? However, he wasn't intimidated, instead finding his own motivation in this. If he couldn't solve the Deep Blue's finances right now, what was the use of keeping him as a treasurer? Any high-level elf could take care of accounting. Richard and Black Gold were equal in their gloom, but while the dwarf was growing haggard, the boy couldn't be any more different. Stood in front of a full-length mirror on the last day of autumn, he carefully scrutinized himself. He was growing into a model male form, broad shoulders, a muscular chest, a rapidly shrinking waistline, a tight yet powerful behind, and even a pair of elven legs that were slender yet toned. His face had changed a little as well. Perhaps it was because he hadn't smiled in ages, or perhaps because of how much time he'd spent in a thoughtful silence. The remnants of his immature gentle youth were wiped away, being replaced by sharpened and obvious edges. It was much like a steely rock being shaped by a giant axe, flowing lava hidden within every single line. As for his eyes, they were peaceful as the depths of the world, gloomy, ice-cold, and bottomless. A fleeting thought passed his mind as Richard turned his gaze towards his lower body. His member was already standing upright, ready to thrust and conquer at any moment. It still had room to grow in the future, but it was extraordinary even now. Laying eyes upon this proud, lethal weapon of his, a trace of a long-forgotten smile surfaced at the corners of Richard's mouth. He was already a man. At that moment, Aaron's sharp and clear yet serious voice suddenly sounded next to Richard. "Yes, just last night." His body immediately started to shake. He raised both hands in an attempt to cover his ears, but put them down midway. He knew, no matter how hard he tried, this conversation would play out to the end once more. "Why?" "I need money. I have plenty. But I don't want yours." He stopped looking at himself in the mirror, instead taking big strides towards the laboratory even as the conversation continued to ring out in his ears. In the corner of the laboratory was a steel doll, crafted for him to test the might of his spells. Right now, however, it served as a whetstone for his fist. This was what he did whenever his heart burned so painfully that he couldn't contain it, using the doll to build his physical strength even as he tormented himself. This time was no exception. Richard walked towards the steel doll, standing in front of it as was his usual practice. His legs were a shoulder width apart, the perfect stance in preparation for a fight. He took a deep breath as he looked at the steel doll, its bright and clean surface clearly reflecting his face. For some reason the sight of his face on the armor overwhelmed him with an uncontrollable surge of wrath. He loathed himself to the core, detesting how he hadn't realized Aaron's embarrassment even more earlier. Instead he just indulged in his own loss, silently waiting for an outcome he couldn't accept. His wrath set his veins on fire, and his blood boiled as it turned into waves of lava that crashed into the top of his head. The burning blood suddenly bestowed upon him an endless strength. Every vein, every artery was so close to bursting open under immense pressure, and every energy channel of his meridians seemed to be broken by the gushes of blood. Richard let out a crazed, bestial roar and raised his fist, pounding it fiercely on the steel doll's chest. The refined steel caved in, leaving faint cracks on the surface of the doll. Richard's entire forearm made its way through the doll's chest, so strong that a subtle whirlpool of power formed as he clenched the doll tightly in his fist. The object got deformed further and further, and by the time his newfound strength was completely gone, he'd managed to throw the doll out behind him and crush it against the wall. This was a standard magic doll, designed to emulate a knight wearing half-body plate armor. The damage done to it meant Richard's single punch was strong enough to kill an elite knight in one shot, able to compare to the weakened fireball in terms of damage. That was how, on the day autumn gave way to winter, Richard Arcaron awakened his first bloodline ability, Eruption. Winter passed just like it should have, a somber and desolate time for every being in the plane. Even the creatures that could survive freezing climates preferred spring and summer, because that was when they could seek out food, mate, and store up in preparation for late autumn and the next winter. To Richard, however, there was no difference. The young bird staring at the world with an inquisitive gaze had shut its eyes completely, sealing off its senses. He no longer concerned himself about anything else in the outside world, only devoting himself entirely to the world of magic. His mana growth remained insane, and he even achieved 24 points of peak mana to exceed level 3. Nearly all of Richard's professors grew wild with joy over his improvement. There was one exception, the maestro who taught him art. Every painting the boy submitted made him feel more and more suffocated. It was all sketched plainly, drawn stroke by stroke with a fine quill pen. His art had paid particular attention to the composition of light and shadows at the start, portraying all kinds of characters. The man had taught him that portraits were the soul of art, but the people in Richard's art pieces grew fewer and fewer in number even as the environments grew more stifling and depressing. By the end the paintings were better off without any life forms in them, and even the scenery was gradually blurred. In the eyes of the maestro, they'd only grown more powerful than before, like the surface of a dark ocean whose gentle waves didn't warn of the upcoming storm. Sometimes, the master couldn't resist but analyzed the lines in great detail. Every single sketch, every coil, every smooth line seemed to speak to him like a soul crying out from the depths of hell, each stroke holding great power. The artist couldn't imagine how Richard felt as he painted them, and one day the man who was a mere level 12 mage found himself unable to bear the impact of these images. It was his duty as a tutor to seriously examine every single painting that Richard had submitted, but the light in Richard's paintings was growing fainter and fainter. The backgrounds were growing more fuzzy, huge shadows starting to devour large areas. There finally came a day when Richard submitted a painting that was just messy lines. He'd smashed every single object he could destroy in the studio. There were two trivial matters in the winter that slightly disrupted Richard's life. First, Richard had encountered that young mage called Stephen once again during one of his lessons. The youth was so cordial and elegant that there was nothing one could criticize him about, fully exhibiting the etiquette of a child of nobility. As he was also another of Sharon's personal apprentices, it was only natural for the two to not be estranged. Another of the legendary mage's students was present as well, Minnie. The girl was usually reserved and dispassionate, but this time she was quite lively as she actively participated in the conversation after listening for a while, bringing some topics up herself. Both Stephen and Minnie were quite accomplished in their study of magic, so their discussion didn't stray far from the field. Although Richard normally didn't wish to speak to anyone, discussions about magic were an exception. He had to bite the bullet, chatting with them for a while. Thankfully the lesson started soon, so he managed to return to solitude quick enough. Throughout that conversation he'd been able to feel a subtle hostility from them. Although they concealed it very well, precision caught the tiniest movements of their limbs and his intellect allowed him to analyze the meaning of those gestures. It was normal for rivalry to exist, and practically everyone in the Deep Blue except Sharon and Aaron viewed him with some amount of hostility. However, he didn't understand why Stephen or Minnie would see him as a threat even though their family backgrounds were much greater than his own. In any case, they weren't actually important to him, so they'd been mostly wiped from memory by nightfall. The other trifle was that he had seen Aaron again. It was just a glimpse of a silhouette far away in the trading area near the bottom level, where it was bustling with people. She had only flashed by, but Richard knew that it was her. Aaron was accompanied by a guy who was openly grabbing her waist, and they seemed very intimate. It didn't matter where they were going or what they were doing, because it was crystal clear that what had to be done was already done. It made no difference even if it was any more or less. Richard didn't chase after her, nor did he take a second glance. The young man next to Aaron seemed to be Stephen, but he didn't care to continue along that line of thought either. Whoever it was no longer important. Richard erased her and the man from his mind relatively easily. It was still difficult to forget everything, but there were many ways to stop the pain. This was perhaps one of Richard's takeaways that winter. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 25. Breakthrough. The two trivial affairs, especially the scene he'd witnessed of Aaron being intimate with another man, had actually greatly affected Richard. It was just that he had no clue of the extent of it at the time. The next morning, the entirety of Flo Bay was still in a deep slumber. Winter was passing and the solstice was coming soon, so there was still time before the sun would appear. Still, this didn't affect how brightly lit it was outdoors. Icicles filled the ground, the hills, the vegetation, and the river's surface. Everything was frozen solid, reflecting blue and white light everywhere. Only the surface of the sea in Flo Bay was still rippling with waves. Richard couldn't sleep. Stood in front of the full-length window, which was more than 10 meters tall, he silently observed the magnificence of Flo Bay in all its frigid and desolate glory. Spitting out a mouthful of foul air that he had kept repressed inside him, he suddenly felt as though his horizons had been widened and he had grown more open-minded. It was as though he could practically contain the entirety of Flo Bay within him. The past few seasons had only left faint traces of darkness in such a massive space. Perhaps these feelings of gloom would linger in his own mind for a long time to come, or perhaps he would feel the ache whenever he thought of them for the rest of his life, but what followed every memory of suffering and pain was wealth. Richard began to open his eyes and observe the world around him. The first thing that caught his attention were the various kinds of people in the deep blue. He'd interacted most with his mage professors, and by now they weren't refined machines that sputtered out knowledge any longer. Instead, they were living humans, elves, dwarves, even drow. These mentors had their own share of emotions, and demanded their own benefits. They regarded everyone differently, and didn't treat everyone the same as well. Every single action of theirs led to a different conclusion in Richard's reality, waving a hand, throwing a kick, raising an eyebrow, or even adjusting their gaze. Even the same phrases, when spoken in different languages with different intonation, had different meanings behind them. Richard's understanding of his teachers grew with each passing day, and he observed them with great detail, adding on to the number of samples in his memory that he could use for comparisons. He suddenly realized that most of his mentors' words and expressions actually had hidden meanings behind them, which he was still gradually discovering. The professors came from various fields, so their relationships were different as well. Some of these fields were located near each other, while others were probably worlds apart. Those who came from similar fields often didn't share good relationships, and those like Popovich and Riley explicitly trampled on each other's words. On the other hand, the ones who came from fields that had nothing to do with each other were on much better terms, and some of them were even close friends. Contemplating these newfound observations of his, Richard discovered that the key to all these relationships was competition, something governed by benefits called coins. After he opened his eyes, Richard gained more knowledge. For instance, he now finally understood why so many geometry, mathematics, drawing, and magic formation lessons had suddenly been added into his curriculum. He also found out about his future status as a Saint Runemaster. So Master wants to groom me into a Runemaster, Richard thought to himself. Although he was a youngster who had grown up in the mountains, Richard's horizons had widened substantially after spending more than a year in the deep blue. He was no longer that young boy who had no clue about how things worked. However, although the position of a Runemaster surpassed many others, it was as insipid as water in Richard's eyes. The boy had no idea how the decade of Elena's implicit influence turned him indifferent to privileges or humiliation. Regardless of his thoughts, he wouldn't let his master's expectations of him go down the drain. Children who grew up in the mountains were often stubborn, but they were also clear about their preferences and dislikes. Richard was very intelligent, and having been exposed to a great deal of suffering and twists and turns in his life, he was more mature than his peers. Now he knew well he had a special position in the deep blue, and even better about how many people would go wild over the amount of delight that he received from his master every month. Many gazes leveled on him came with hidden motives, containing envy, longing, and a desire to rob him of everything he had. Yet those kinds of people kept a distance from him, not daring to conspire against him as they wished. The incident with Papin was an accident. He was just one of those noble children who knew not how deep the waters he was treading in were. He also realized that a couple of people always tailed him from a distance, wherever he went. Perhaps it was because of how those giving him the harsh, malicious stares always retreated in fear, or his own gut feeling, but he knew that these were protectors, not spies. Thinking of how carefree and thrifty his master was, these actions caused him to feel faintly warm and fuzzy. This was the only source of warmth that Richard received this winter. Fortunately, his studies weren't affected at all even during these confusing times, and he instead made leaps and bounds in his magic progress. The newfound thoughts of his gave his maturing self some reassurance. The winter passed as it should, and spring was somehow here again. After completing his studies for the day, Richard dragged his lethargic body back to his residence. When he passed by the steel doll that was standing upright and alone in a corner, he suddenly realized that it was his birthday again. Apart from its intact head, the rest of the steel doll had already been distorted so severely that it was deformed, and it was practically impossible to envision how it used to look. This was the result of the numerous times that Richard had lashed at it with eruption activated. The wall around it was also covered in bumps of all sizes, traces of the doll having rammed into it. Richard walked next to the doll and gently caressed the motley indentations of all sizes. Some of the dents had pointed edges and razor-sharp crevices. It wasn't just his fists that left these marks, but also his elbows, shoulders, knees, and even his head. Some of these dents were even tainted with dried-up bloodstains. After experiencing the faint feeling of pain from his fingertips and seeing the patches of bloodstains, Richard finally understood how he actually wasn't lonely at all throughout winter. He thought he had spent it occupying himself and passing the season in silence, but the pain was always lingering around. It was just hidden so deep that he nearly thought that he had forgotten it. The head of the steel doll was in perfect condition. Its squeaky clean and round surface reflected Richard's somewhat changed face, but the rest of it was utterly destroyed. Most of the parts were only held together by thin wire at this point, ready to disintegrate with just another blow to the main body. Richard smiled and patted the doll's face, before taking big strides towards his bedroom. The next day's curriculum included a drawing class. After listening to an entire lesson about the theory of art appreciation, a dozen students courteously submitted their rough sketches, which were assigned as homework, before leaving one after the other. Richard was the last one to step forward. For some reason the maestro felt extremely uncomfortable even if Richard still looked like a teenager. He subconsciously averted his gaze, the mere thought of Richard's drawings making him feel like a moist, freezing creature was pressed up against his body. He couldn't shake it off no matter how hard he tried, making him very upset. The man's gaze swept across the assignment that Richard was about to submit, and he heaved a sigh of relief when he realized that it was just a small drawing in a 30-centimeter wide square. It was a scenic drawing, depicting Flow Bay during winter. Through his usual brushwork, Richard had illustrated the bitter winter in its somber yet exceptionally magnificent beauty in great detail. In comparison to his previous works, which were ominous and hysterical, this drawing finally marked a rare return to Richard's normal works. However, the power contained in the lines of this drawing still sent a faint chill down the mage's spine. After letting out a relieved sigh, he suddenly realized that Richard's gaze was still fixated on him. The boy's bottomless pupils were like blue gems. "Does this painting look a lot more comforting?" Richard's gentle words actually caused the maestro to break out into a cold sweat. He instinctively jumped up from his seat and almost tripped over the edge of his robe. He couldn't be bothered about how unkempt he looked, and wagged a finger at Richard. You. In contrast, Richard was as cool-headed as an iceberg. A graceful and beautiful smile was plastered on his face, yet it looked like the enticing expression of a devil trying to lure him in. But no matter how attractive the devil's murmurs were, the maestro knew that there was a much more painful price to pay behind it. His soul would be lost in the deep abyss forever. Upon seeing that rare smile on Richard's face, more beads of cold sweat started to drip down the man's back. What frightened him the most was this: if he didn't remember wrongly, Richard had only just turned 12. The level 12 mage wanted to question how Richard had read his mind, but even if the words were at the tip of his tongue, he held back. Regardless of how it was that this pupil of his had found out, he knew it all. The man calmed himself down, realizing Richard still had more to say. He was only a 12-year-old child, yet it was so hard to fathom him. These paintings were constant reminders of how crazy it was in this young boy's inner world. The great artist took a deep breath. He straightened his clothes, adapting the proper demeanor of a teacher before sitting down and motioning for Richard to do the same. The boy didn't take a seat, however, instead greeting him with a respectful bow just like any other acolyte consulting him about schoolwork. He then asked gracefully, in a practiced manner, "Professor, first of all I would like to ask about how the world of a rune master looks." The maestro was stunned by this question, but he shook his head in reply, "I'm no rune master, just a useless level 12 mage. If you want knowledge about runecrafting, ask Grand Mage Fair, he teaches you as well. You could try Professor Hero as well, either of them has much more knowledge of runes than me." Richard interrupted the maestro, "No, I'm not looking for professional knowledge about runecrafting. I want to know more about the outside world, what a rune master does, what duties they have, and how they live their lives. I'd also like to know which rune masters are famous right now, their lives before they made a name for themselves, their past achievements and so on. Professors Fair and Huru both spent most of their time in the Deep Blue, and aren't well traveled like you are. You were also an honored guest at the royal families of the 3 human empires at one point in time, so you must certainly know more about these matters than others. Richard's question startled the man once again. He didn't understand why the boy wanted to ask about stories that had nothing to do with the matter at hand. Or rather, he'd thought of a possibility but felt like that was rather unbelievable. Conventional logic stated a 12-year-old would be considering things like that. He still asked out of prudence, "Why do you want to know about all this?" "I want to become a rune master, so I need to know about what the world of rune masters is like, and how I can gain an upper hand in that industry. Learning about the lives of historical and actual great rune masters will tell me about the setbacks and experiences that they once faced. At least I can learn from history and refrain from making the same mistakes that they did." Richard replied. After a short pause, he added, "The world of a rune master is probably different from what bystanders see." The great master instantaneously broke out in cold sweat once again. This was precisely the possibility that he had in mind. Now, he couldn't decline Richard. He was also willing to impart his knowledge to this young child in front of him, just because he felt like it. After those silent exchanges with Richard through his drawings all this while, he felt that the boy was rather different from the rest of his students. He organized his train of thought, and slowly said, "All right. Firstly, in my opinion, rune masters aren't the creators of miracle, instead the weavers of nightmares. They're the very reason that rune knights are armed to the teeth, able to crush forts, checkpoints, and mountain passes that were once considered infallible to smithereens under their iron hooves. Their appearance turned the world around, substantially accelerating Norland's expansion into other planes. Without them, the world wouldn't be the same, and so many lives wouldn't have been lost. In other words, the rune masters are actually the creators of the warcore." Richard interrupted the artist, concluding his words concisely. The man sighed with deep sorrow. "You could say that." But, the great master was reluctant to have Richard arrive at such a conclusion, and he struggled to justify himself. However, after much consideration, he couldn't help but say, "Fine, you're right. It's just like how legendary beings pose a fatal threat to royal families and other nobles. Legendary beings, regardless of occupation, can become the most dangerous of assassins. On the other hand, rune masters are held in high esteem because they can destroy countries. A small troop of rune knights can defeat a large army of thousands of people regardless of how small they are. Now, let's start with Lord Rodander. He was the first rune master in the continent who actually had a sense of justice. The maestro's retelling was concise and animated. His few words made it seem like a once almighty rune master was standing right before Richard's eyes. Rune masters made use of their wisdom and talents to create countless troops of rune knights, each branded with the mark of the rune master who created them. All rune masters had vastly different creations, allowing one to exhibit their personality and innate talents at will. The most famous rune masters of history had left behind their own masterpieces, like Lamon's illusory suits, Ricardomo's crimson knights, or St. Peter's holy equipment. Although these things had eventually been copied, they were never surpassed. It took an entire hour for the maestro to draw a clear outline of the history of runecrafting. Had he spoken in any detail, it would likely have taken him 10 days to a month. Richard spoke once again after the maestro took a break. "Thank you, Professor. My second request is that you introduce me to someone." The artist nodded and replied, "I know of a lot of people in the Deep Blue, one could say I know most of the special ones. What kind of people do you want me to introduce you to? Women?" Ha ha. The maestro's joke didn't elicit a smile. Richard instead lowered his head, keeping silent for a long while before he looked back up with determination in his face. "I'm looking for someone who can teach me how to kill. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 26. The Art of Killing. What? The great mage suddenly felt his entire body turn cold, as if he had jumped outside the window into Flow Bay, naked. He had never imagined Richard would ask him something like that. While this boy was more taciturn than the average child, he was still a 12-year-old who was diligent and ambitious. Here he was, wanting to kill someone. All the works of art Richard had drawn before appeared in the great mage's mind in that moment. The boundless strength hidden within them, the great mage realized that he was wrong in treating Richard as an ordinary little boy. Some 12-year-old human nobles were extremely mature, while 15 was their standard for adulthood. Outside human control, some beast tribes considered children who were 6 or 7 to be matured as well. Coming to this thought, the maestro stood tall and asked with seriousness, "I do know someone you'd like to meet, a true expert at murder, but first tell me why you'd need to learn how to kill." "Rune masters are harbingers of war," Richard answered. "Only by learning how to kill can I create outstanding rune knights." But Richard's answer left the great mage helpless yet again. It took him a few deep breaths, but he eventually managed to suppress his feelings and speak slowly. "That's a great reason." "It sounds untrue, but never mind that. Any reason is good enough as long as there is one. As for the person I was talking about, his name is Naya. Many years ago, most everyone called him the Blade of Calamity. You should be able to get what you want from him." Richard nodded, bowing primly to the great mage before he handed the man a sheet of paper. The maestro thought it was an assignment, but it was actually a proof of payment signed by Richard, showing that the great mage had taught him a certain number of lessons. Most of these lessons didn't exist, but with this receipt the maestro would be able to get gold from the deep blue. It would amount to over 10,000 extra, an amount he couldn't just ignore. This process was extremely safe as well, because one-on-one lessons was something students paid for themselves. The Deep Blue would check with Richard for this, and if there was no harm to their finances, they naturally would not pursue this matter further. Seeing this proof of payment, the artist's mage went into chaos. Was this a bribe? Richard! He called the boy who was about to leave, grabbing his messy hair to ask, "Why ask me for help?" "Because I thought it would be the easiest way." "Then what if I didn't help you? Who would you look for help from?" The Grand Mage did not back down. "Black gold." The great mage suddenly understood. In little Richard's eyes, those who worked in arts and played with gold were both quite unreliable, which was why he had chosen this place. However, he was very curious about something else. "Who will you look for if this doesn't work out?" Richard answered instantly, "Those grand mages who only want to teach students." Late into the night, Richard left the Deep Blue's main towers to arrive at some buildings at the borders. There were many mages within the main towers, with at least 20 to 30 people serving them each. This pushed a lot of people into the surrounding areas, because the rent in the main towers wasn't something any mage below level 10 could afford. Even a little room with only a bed was impossible to get. The external districts were graded into different regions based on their distance from the main towers. The ring closest to the Deep Blue had many mages, most of them below level 10. They didn't have the means to stay in the Deep Blue itself, but they could somewhat settle in the outer regions with difficulty. Covered up in a dark cloak, Richard weaved his way through numerous districts to reach the outermost one. He sensed all sorts of gazes trained on him on the way, some from arrogant level 8 mages and other malicious ones from shady characters. Most were of curiosity. After all, those who wandered these districts were acquainted with each other or at least had seen each other before. That made strangers very eye-catching. It was the marking of a level 3 mage on the cloak that helped Richard avoid a great deal of trouble. At the end of an alley that was dark and devoid of people stood a worn-out little tavern. There was a huge gash on its wooden signboard, where one could barely make out the crude image of a half-naked woman. The door was ajar, revealing the dimly lit and quiet interior of the tavern without any bars. The only thing that made it outside was the pungent smell of alcohol. It was now winter, and the harsh cold was everywhere. The deep blue had its magic to keep the inner regions warm, another factor leading to the high rent in the place and the arrogance of the residents, but a small alley outside the main tower like this was very cold. With a tavern of this size, even if it supplied heating that would only make it slightly warmer than the outside, an entire month's profits would not be able to support keeping it at room temperature for a day. The bit of warmth was quite substantial in Richard's senses, but most ordinary people did not find much of a difference between -30 and -50 degrees Celsius. In such terrible weather and with such a remote location, this tavern obviously would not have many guests. Richard pushed the tavern door open and walked in. The tavern was not very large, with only 3 tables, and the bartender was a man of average physique and appearance. His half-grizzled hair was beginning to show his age. 2 tall, sturdy men dressed in tattered clothing were sitting at a table in the corner, leaning comfortably into the wall as they ate and drank bit by bit. The alcohol smelled strong, which meant it had come cheap. Paired with that was a small plate of an unknown sliced meat, so dry that it seemed to have no water at all. Just the sight of it could make anyone lose their appetite, but these men were ever so careful as they picked it up piece by piece, chewing and trying to appreciate the taste before they took several large gulps of the strong alcohol. It was just a small plate, but by the looks of it they wouldn't finish it by the end of the night. Richard took a look around, understanding the situation here soon enough. The man behind the bar cleaned a glass while shooting Richard a glance. "Little guy, didn't your mother tell you that you can only drink after you become of age? Of course, if you have the money, I wouldn't mind pouring you a glass or two." Richard lifted his hood and spoke, "I'm not here to drink. I'm looking for someone." "Who?" The bartender seemed interested. "The Blade of Calamity." The moment these words left his mouth, Richard felt like he'd fallen into an icy cave. He froze so stiff he couldn't even move a finger, and all parts of his body except his head stopped listening to him. The chilly air assaulting him pierced his skin sharply, feeling like the pinpricks of millions of needles. This was the first time in his life Richard had been exposed to killing intent. It was like time itself had stopped. The 2 men by the table halted all movement, maintaining their poses. One was stuck pouring the drink down his throat, while the other still had a piece of meat that was so thin it seemed translucent held high in the air. However, they didn't seem immobile like he was. While their movements did stop, their gazes locked onto the boy. Their expressions said nothing. The man behind the bar stopped cleaning a glass, gazing at the flickering candles on the wall. It took him a moment to return from his memories, after which he turned towards Richard. "That's a name I haven't used in a long time. Call me Naya. Anyone who knows about the Blade of Calamity is a friend. I'm curious, though, what does a child want with me? I want to learn how to kill." Richard's words were to the point, just like always. "Why?" "Because I feel like I'll need the knowledge soon." Naya nodded, not pressing him further. He switched tracks. "This is the deep blue, even if it's an outer region. I've prepared the fee," Richard answered. The corner of Naya's lips curved as he smiled, the icy sting of the killing intent disappearing. "My lessons are expensive. I'll need at least 500 gold coins every day." Richard produced an intricate magic pouch, opened it, and poured out a pile of flickering gold coins onto the bar counter. "I've prepared 1,000. So teach me everything you can." Naya nonchalantly glanced at the pile of gold coins in front of him and chuckled. "Isn't a prepubescent child with so much money unafraid that I'd gobble you down, seeing as you ran into the nest of a killer? I'm guessing that guy who loves drawing women introduced you, but that guy is a spineless person and can't be trusted. So, tell me why I shouldn't kill you right away." "Because I only brought the gold coins for today." Naya grinned even more brightly. "Smart kid. But it's best if you give me another reason. Sometimes I do things for money, but other times not so much. For safety's sake, it's best that you don't assume that I just want that bit of money." Richard hesitated for a while before speaking again. "My name is Richard R. Karen. I'm a personal apprentice of Her Excellency Sharon, and the son of Gatton R. Karen. The smile on Naya's face froze, and he suddenly coughed out some spittle, yelling at the two men at the table, "What do you say, guys?" The man on the left put his glass down. "Those two are maniacs. If you do anything to this boy here, Gatton will drag you out of hell if need be, and Her Excellency will make sure you regret ever having lived for the next 1,000 years. The man on the right placed the meat back on the plate and looked at little Richard, saying, "Don't you think this little guy is interesting? Teaching a little guy like him must be very fulfilling and profitable. If you think you're earning too much, pass him to me. It's been over a decade since you were the Blade of Calamity anyway. Who knows if you can still move that blade quickly enough anyway? I need money now." "You can keep dreaming, Redbeard," Naya yelled, swiping all the coins on the counter into his pocket like he was afraid they'd go away if he was too slow. His gaze on Richard changed slightly. "What I'm going to teach you isn't just how to kill someone, it's how to destroy a life. We start now." It was early morning when Richard returned to his residence. He saw the steel puppet that was ridden with wounds on the way to his bedroom, and the eye-catching head devoid of any damage. He stopped to gaze at it for a while, before sighing suddenly and muttering to himself, "I won't need you anymore in the future, but..." He brushed past the puppet, his left hand barely discernible as it brushed the puppet's neck before he headed towards his room. With a clank, the puppet's head silently detached from the body and crashed to the ground, flying a far distance. The cut at the neck was as smooth as a mirror, like it had been sliced by a sharp blade. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 27. The Power to Change the World. Spring arrived once more, and Richard was about to turn 13. Of course, the boy did not know that this spring would hold a special meaning for him. As controllers of war, it wasn't truly important for rune masters to kill with their own hands. This was especially true for someone at Richard's level. However, every night he spent in that little tavern in the outer regions gave Richard a newfound understanding of magic formations, dimensions, or his other homework. What had originally been a bunch of static numbers now connected, everything affecting everything else, not just in the moment, in that place, but elsewhere and other times as well. The fireball spell formation was a simple example. Its instant attack was the same whether it was used in a desert or a forest, but over 3 to 5 years the formation would increase the fire elements in a desert. Oases would shift several kilometers away, perhaps drying out further as well. On the other hand, a large formation would burn many trees away in a forest, reducing the density and variety of the greenery. However, once the trees burned to ashes, the wind would spread their seeds elsewhere. The soil would recover over time, growing fertile once more. Such long-term effects were useless in a single battle, but over a prolonged war that lasted more than a century, these things could affect the development of societies and entire races. It gave Richard a proper understanding of what rune masters were, of what they did, and why they were called controllers of war. However, even he himself was in disbelief of such a thing. Such thoughts could be coincidental, but pure logic told him it was more probable that excessive fatigue was causing him to hallucinate. One certain night, he found himself unable to sleep. All his experiences from childhood till date suddenly surged to the front of his mind, and the huge amount of knowledge he'd gained in the Deep Blue merged and linked to answer many questions he'd had in the past. Inspiration surged like a spring, while his heart began to pound quickly. He suddenly sat up and charged into his laboratory, preparing over 100 items in one go. He spread the hide of a high-level beast out, taking a few magic pens with special mithril tips to begin carving a magic formation. The night silently passed, but the rays of magic never faded, causing one to lose track of time. Switching through 22 different types of magic pens, damaging 6, and using no less than 200 different types of magic ingredients, he finally managed to draw a complete magic formation. The square hide turned extremely rigid, and the rays of light from the formation itself circulated around it. As long as Richard pushed his mana inside, the spell formation would activate automatically to increase his innate agility. Once he saw this hide, Richard himself couldn't believe his eyes. This was the result of his entire night passing like a dream, and if one ignored the material issues and small flaws it would garner another name in the outside world. This was a rune. Although only the most basic of runes, elementary agility, it was a rune nonetheless. He may have learnt all the theory and the foundational subjects systematically over the past years, but Richard had yet to start on making runes. Although this rune had a lot of room for improvement, and was almost useless, it was a substantial improvement for him personally. Once a mage could cast a spell of a certain grade, it wouldn't be hard for them to learn other spells of that grade, and the same was true of runemasters and runes. Holding this crude rune, Richard's mind was filled with all sorts of thoughts. His hard work, his conjectures, the suffering, it all came to mind. All that time of being unwilling to waste a single moment, working hard bit by bit, had finally come to fruition. The pain and fervor that he'd hidden deep in his veins had pushed him to success. If one wished to find the source of his motivation now, it could be seen easily with 3 words: success follows accumulation. All sorts of feelings welled up in his mind, but Richard only allowed himself 3 minutes to dwell on them. He knew full well that everything in the deep blue was built up high in the clouds, where his dreams could be destroyed in an instant. The massive fees, the great amount of materials he needed to use, the mana potions he drank like water every day, and this residence that was so huge he felt uneasy living in it. It was all built on Sharon's delight. Put bluntly, Richard's life depended on the legendary mage's moods. Before his talent gave way to true power, he was just like a painting on the wall, something that could only be admired, not used. A proverb had made it down the annals of history: there was no free lunch in the world. This lunch that came from a legendary mage, so rich and ridiculous, how could it possibly be free? Naya's reaction had told Richard that the father of his, who he hated to the core, was definitely someone well known on the continent. He'd also learnt that people feared Gatton Archaron far more than they liked him. That background gave him some conjectures as to the source of Sharon's delight. Of course his own hard work was a part of everything, but Gatton's influence had a hand in it as well. Richard knew full well that everything he owned, including the money he was planning to use to help Erin get through her tough situation, had actually come from his father, the man who he was once curious about, but was now unwilling to even recall. However, he could not just reject all this. It was impossible to continue down the path of magic without a great amount of wealth to support him. With how stubborn he was, he would definitely return all the money he had gotten from Gatton with interest before he could fulfill his mother's wishes and never see his father again. Or perhaps one day the father and son would meet again, on the battlefield in another plane. After all, the world was filled with inconceivable events. However, Richard had learned a lot from his philosophy classes. Even if he was set on returning everything in the future, with interest, would that mean he could use Gatton's gold as he wished now? Many would perhaps have no qualms with this, but he could not do so. Deep within his blood was an instinctual pride that came from both his parents, and this pride told him he couldn't cheat himself so shamelessly. Now, however, this rune was a turning point. This thin piece of hide was proof that he could create standard runes quite soon, and developing from elementary agility into other basic runes. Even as someone who was used to living in the deep blue, the price of the most elementary runes had astonished him in the past, and now he could make money by crafting and selling them. That would make for a sizable amount of money, even if it couldn't compare to how much Sharon was giving him in recent months. Of course Richard wasn't so stupid as to reject that money now that he had the means to earn some himself. The extra gold would give him more ingredients, allow him to train quicker, and granted him even more freedom. If, just as this word popped up in his mind, Richard forced it down. However, he knew full well what he truly wanted to ask. If he had the ability to craft runes before, would he have been able to save Erin? This was a young and innocent question, but instinct gave the boy a brutal, practical answer. Nothing would change. What had happened, and time could not flow backwards. As Richard studied the world of Deep Blue more closely, he garnered a better understanding of the laws of the place. He was gaining greater and greater clarity about the expressions behind people's faces, growing able to see things that were once obscured by numerous veils. Time lost was simple, but this world was complicated. Daybreak. The sun leapt out of the icebergs at the boundaries of Flow Bay, rising up into the sky. A bright sunshine shot through the window and diluted the rune's magic light, causing Richard's fatigued eyes to sting. He rubbed them for a bit before he stowed the rune away, leaving his residence quickly in search of Grand Mage Fair, who taught him magic formations. He wished to determine the next step in his studies. Fair definitely lived up to his title as a Grand Mage. He was level 19, with profound knowledge and innovative theses in the philosophy of magic coming about with fair, genuine ways. Currently his professor in magic formations, he would also teach him to craft runes one day. Runecrafting touched on a great many things, requiring a lot of knowledge, but there was no specific path to it. 1,000 years of research had separated runes into 7 grades, with the first 4 being considered standard. Elementary runecrafting didn't qualify one to be called a runemaster, the title only going to those who could craft runes at grade 2 and above. Great runemasters could craft grade 3 and 4 runes, while anyone who could make grade 5 runes was considered a Saint Runemaster. As for grade 6 and 7, those runes were only conjecture as of now. It was still rather early in the day, and few were out and about in the deep blue. Richard controlled his heart that was thumping with joy, walking hastily away from the teleportation formation to stand at the entrance to Sharon's personal region in the upper layers. 2 giant copper gates guarded the entrance, but they were open be it night or day. There was a magic puppet on each side, and one directed its ruby eye at Richard as it shot out a crimson ray of light. The emblem at the corner of his magic robes immediately lit up in response, and the puppet immediately returned to position as the light in its eye dimmed. The upper layers of the deep blue were reserved for the legendary mage, while the layers just beneath were allocated to a few greatly qualified grand mages in a display of Her Excellency's generosity, trust, and fondness. The daily lives of 17 grand mages revolved around this area that had 5 full levels of the tower, and Fair was one of those mages. By the time Richard was allowed into Professor Fair's personal region, the man had just completed his morning meditation. The Grand Mage wore his robes before he came out, emanating a dense elemental aura. With his affinity for the elements, the sheer concentration of mana around Fair far exceeded that in ordinary space. Just listening to the professor speak would result in long-lasting benefits in terms of mana building, but Fair only released this elemental aura in 2 cases: either he'd just completed his meditation, or he was teaching his most important student. A tiny trace of approval flashed in Fair's eyes when he saw Richard, hard to discern. He pointed at a chair nearby and gestured for Richard to take a seat, grabbing a mana potion and taking a few sips himself. Richard did not sit, however. He instead produced the beast hide with the rune on it, handing it over to the Grand Mage. "This is something I was inspired to write last night, Professor. Please have a look." The intricate and compact patterns alone made it obvious to Fair that this was a superior formation. Fair flashed a rare smile as he took the hid. Just as he was about to praise Richard, however, his expression suddenly changed. He took a few more looks, and couldn't help but begin to tremble. The Grand Mage suddenly stood up in a hurry, knocking the half-empty potion in the process with his sleeve. The bottle fell to the ground, wasting a lot of the 2,000 gold coins it was worth as it shattered with a crash. The usually frugal Fair suddenly didn't care for the potion anymore. He glanced at Richard, his eyes shining with mana as the elements entered chaos around him. He'd practically caused an elemental storm indoors. He asked sternly, "You said you did this last night? Do you know what this is?" The berserk elemental storm caused Richard to feel suffocated, making it difficult to stand in place. Still he answered calmly, "It's a basic buff-type rune, elementary agility. It's only somewhat complete." It was only now that Fair realized he had lost control over himself. The mage slowly retracted the elemental force he'd scattered everywhere, looking at the beast hide in his hands before he spoke slowly, "Only somewhat? Ha, indeed, as a rune it can only barely meet the standards, but few people in history could make a rune that meets the standards before the age of 13. I trust you aren't lying, but this just doesn't make sense. Your lessons haven't converged yet. There should be some other factors that allowed you to gain this sudden enlightenment, giving you a comprehensive understanding of the various systems of magic. If you don't mind, could you tell me of any special situations you've been in lately? It will be useful for your future development. Grandmaster Fair was someone worthy of respect, and Richard felt no negative emotions from him. Besides, the most important thing in this complicated and dangerous world of magic was to have a wise guide. Richard summarized everything he'd experienced outside of class over the last year, although he hid the part that had to do with Aaron. He didn't even hide his studying with Naya. Having heard all that, Fair's eyebrows twitched. He wanted to stand up by instinct, but he controlled himself and leaned against the back of his chair before lifting his hand and indicating for Richard to stop. He then gazed up at the ceiling, deep in thought. He spoke again a moment later, so it's him. I never thought that the Blade of Calamity was in the deep blue. He's called Naya now? That's his real name, something he almost never used. His teachings should be one of the prime reasons you could break the walls between the different subjects. After all, killing and creation are two sides of a coin. Both need knowledge in various areas. Richard hesitated, and then asked, "Can I still continue studying with him?" Grandmaster Fair sighed for a while, and then answered, "By the looks of it now, yes." The Blade of Calamity, no, he's Naya now, was once someone quite influential in the underworld. He nearly turned killing into an art, so at the very least he should be able to teach you for the next few years. However, I'm curious. Why did you suddenly get the idea to learn the art of killing? To create a more powerful rune knight, I need to know the most efficient ways to kill. Richard's answer caused Fair to give him a long look. However, the old Grand Mage eventually shook his head. "That isn't your real reason, I can see it in your eyes. Forget it, I shouldn't be interfering. But know this is the Deep Blue, and everything here belongs to Her Excellency. If anything troubles you, you can approach either me or Sharon herself. The Deep Blue is also a world of mages, and secular power cannot extend all the way here. If the disputes you find yourself affect too much of the outside world, then you can tell your father. The Arcaran family's power has caused many people fear, and Marquis Gatton himself has begun to establish himself in Faust, the capital of legends. That means he has enough power to be at the peak of the secular world." Richard's gaze shifted away. It took a while for him to speak. "I do not want to borrow Marquis Gatton's strength." Aged wisdom allowed Fair to find Richard's little secret in his addressal of the man. However, this didn't surprise him. Everyone who carried the Arcaran name was a strong character. Of course there were other families like that in Norland, such as St. Peter's descendants and Wisma, Egarist, Solem, Julius and the like. Fair nodded and spoke in a low voice. "I actually have one more doubt. The art of killing far exceeds the limits of this domain, which was what allowed you to see the possibilities. However, to merge all 46 of the fundamental runic subjects isn't something even a genius can do. That needs diligence and wisdom, true wisdom, mind you, not intelligence. You, Richard, aren't the most outstanding in the Deep Blue in terms of your wisdom. I thought you'd only be able to craft runes of your own once you turned 15, but you've done it at 12. That doesn't make sense." Even as he asked this, Fair knew there was no answer to this question. The fact was that Richard had taken the most important step for all runemasters, and since he met the requirements, the reasoning didn't matter. Having studied magic philosophy intensely, Fair knew there was a reason behind this. If he couldn't find one right now, it only meant that he didn't see it yet, not that one didn't exist. Norland had far too many secrets, and the numerous universes with their innumerable planes could never be completely explored. It wouldn't be absurd if some bored god suddenly gave Richard complete knowledge of runecrafting out of nowhere. Even St. Peter, who crafted holy equipment, revealed before his death that most of his inspiration had come from the gods. Fair stood up, stowing the rune away. "Never mind, let's not waste time on trivial issues. Whatever the reason is, much of your breakthrough can be attributed to luck, but luck only becomes a greater factor of your strength the further you get. Pausing for a while, the Grand Mage Fair spoke profoundly. Richard, perhaps you still have no idea about how lucky you are. This is an open secret, so there's no need for me to keep it from you. Her Excellency has a habit of having only one apprentice in every domain, so as to continue passing on her knowledge. Her students are dazzling pearls on the crown of magic, and that is especially true for rune masters. So, Richard suddenly understood the malice that came from Stephen and Minnie, as well as the reason for Randolph's plot to kill him despite them having nothing to do with each other before that. From what I know, Stephen was interested in becoming a rune master, and he seems very resolute. However, you're already ahead of him with the most decisive step. That's the reason I told you how to take care of disputes that cannot be resolved. Remember to take care of yourself as well. Richard could tell what Fair was implying, but he remained in disbelief. But this is the Deep Blue. Grandmaster Fair chuckled. No matter how powerful the law is, it can only control the rational people. This caused Richard to bow his head in contemplation. He eventually seemed to understanding the meaning of the words, nodding to Fair. The old mage had packed everything up by then, and some students he had summoned had hurried over. Now, come with me, lucky boy, and I'll show you how rune masters create miracles. I'm sure seeing this will give you a greater understanding of the world of rune masters than half-true sayings and old legends. An hour later, Richard and Fair were seated within a magic laboratory situated outside the Deep Blue. The place was giant and open air, allowing the testing of large-scale magic or even legendary spells. It was normally also used as an arena for beast fights, to test new magic beasts or fresh summons. A violent, armored warhorse was brought into the lab arena under Richard's gaze. This was a type of magic beast local to the Deep Blue, much larger than ordinary warhorses with a layer of scales as hard as steel covering its back. The beast was untamable, its metallic hooves able to crush a polar bear's skull while its speed and jump height could compare to mare's deer. All these factors summed up to give it few natural predators. The most valuable part of the armored warhorse was the metallic scales on its back. They were stronger than the strongest metals in production, but still as light as feathers. On top of that, they took easily to magic, not requiring too much of a complicated process to attach runes to. In order to prevent these tyrannical magical beasts from suddenly going berserk, they had to pass through a very long, dark, and narrow pathway. The moment the armored horse entered the laboratory, the open space that suddenly appeared before it caused it to pause. This was a huge area with a circumference of over 1,000 meters, with all sorts of terrain on it. After so many experiments, the dense mana remnants and the many bloodstains from magic beasts over the years caused it to grow guarded. The moment the warhorse paused, Richard saw that a portion of the scales on its chest had been removed. The elementary agility rune had been placed there instead, and this obviously wasn't just a simple embedding. The beast hide had been trimmed and processed, planted on the corresponding spot with meticulous care. The armored warhorse's snorts grew rougher, and the rune at its chest began to flicker. This was a sign that the rune had absorbed the beast's mana, beginning to activate. Stimulated by powerful bloodlust, the horse went completely berserk. It got up on two legs and released a long neigh, beginning to charge like lightning once its hooves touched the ground. It looked like it wanted to jump over two piles of logs in its way, breaking through the border fences to regain its freedom. Just as the armored horse jumped into the air, the rune suddenly emanated dazzling light. The horse showed astounding ability as one leap took it astoundingly far, crossing the first pile but then smashing it into the second. This jump alone was half a fold of increased jump distance. Wood shavings flew everywhere, and the heavy logs were sent rolling by the impact. A log that was half a meter long was the one to bear the brunt of the impact, almost being torn in half. The warhorse grew dizzy with the impact, its head spinning as it couldn't determine its location. It started charging in all directions, the rune on its chest glowing as it further increased its speed. However, this evidently surpassed the limits of the horse's control. It sometimes ran too far, or sometimes it misjudged the distance and crashed into the fence. Sometimes it just jumped too high or too far, causing it to lose its balance midair and fall face down. Dull thuds sounded everywhere, and pieces of wood, mud, and stone fell everywhere. The gigantic body of the warhorse practically turned into a black phantom as it darted around at unimaginable speeds, smashing right into the obstacles with its body. With its body weight and speed, the horse itself had become a terrifying weapon, the slightest of impacts causing terrifying damage. Watching the armored horse speeding around the lab like lightning, Richard could only gape. He was quite familiar with this often-seen beast, but he'd never thought it could reach such speeds. Seeing the terrifying power of the horse after it sped up. This was like a whole new species. Was this the power of a rune master? Little Richard suddenly found his mouth going dry. He felt like he was a baby who had grabbed a metal sword, wanting to use it as a toy, but only found out after brandishing it that this sword had the power to destroy anything he saw. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 28. The First Blow. However, could he handle this strength? For the first time in his life, Richard found himself wavering. The horse lost stamina quickly, slowing down. It was still much faster than most armored horses, but its stamina dropped faster and faster until, after bashing into one last obstacle, it was completely fatigued. It gave a pitiful cry, collapsing to the ground with a large amount of froth at its mouth. Its hooves twitched for a moment, and then stopped moving. Richard cried out, not expecting this outcome, and gazed with urgency at Grand Mage Fair. The old mage patted him, saying, "No need to panic. An ordinary rune would only raise its speed by 30%, but the one you made isn't good enough. It's up to a 50% increase, so the horse couldn't bear the rune. This was just an experiment anyway, that's why we just forced the rune on it. If everything was perfect, the rune wouldn't have harmed it at all. Now, I'm sure you've seen how rune masters can change the world." Richard nodded. His heart was still thumping wildly, leaving him unable to speak. This is a power that can change the world. Use it wisely, you in particular. Fair stated meaningfully and took Richard away. Richard was given permission to rest that day, something he needed desperately. Drawing the rune had left him in a state of excitement the entire night, and he'd already lost all his strength and mana. He hadn't been able to contain his excitement at the sight of the rune he'd made himself, but once he calmed down he felt a wave of fatigue overcome him. It felt like heavy stones were pressing down on his eyelids, leaving him unable to open them all the way. The only thing he wanted at that point was to fall asleep in place. Fair called a mage on shift and asked him to bring Richard back to his residence alongside two strong beings of another race. Once the mage on duty left, he thought over it once more and called a student next to him. He passed a receipt for things to buy, sending Richard a box each of powerful mana potions and energy potions from his own pocket. This student was already 30, and had followed the Grand Mage for many years. Although he only looked slightly shocked on the surface, his mind was already surging with storms. The two boxes would only have 10 potions each, but each potion would be far more effective than those from the outside. While Fair had a high rank in Deep Blue, and his income matched his status, these two boxes of potions were akin to his salary for an entire month. This was the income he used not just for his own expenses, but also to operate his lab and pay his staff, but the other young students next to him couldn't hide their thoughts either. There was a lot of astonishment and envy, and only a small number were indifferent to the situation. The testing of the rune took up the whole morning. Fair took a look at the magic hourglass that told the time, and found that the afternoon magic philosophy lessons were about to begin. The teleportation formation in the northeast corner flickered at that moment, and Stephen and Minnie walked out. Seeing the Grand Mage in the distance, Stephen immediately cried out, "Professor Fair, I finally found you." The cultured and refined youth revealed an impatience and joy that could not be restrained. The youth ran up to Fair, giving him a respectful blow while filled with anxiousness. It had to be said that his etiquette and bearing was outstanding amongst people of his age. Considering his great family background and splendid talent, the fact that he was even doing this was admirable. Compared to him, Sharon's other two apprentices as of now were obviously lacking. Many often unknowingly displayed arrogance, while Richard mostly cared for nobody and nothing. Be it in class or in break, the boy was focused on his notes and the teaching material, basically ignoring everything in his surroundings. Many who wanted to befriend him would find themselves at a loss. Professor Fair, I created this last night after a sudden gush of inspiration. Please appraise it. Stephen's tone showed his eagerness. His humble attitude couldn't hide the pride he felt in his accomplishment, and one could not help but be curious about what he'd brought. The youth carefully opened a leather suitcase in his hands that was made with magic, revealing a hexagonal beast hide that he passed to Fair. This dark red beast hide had a strong smell of sulfur. There were dark patterns on it that looked like bloodstains, with the large black spots showing that it had been taken from an extremely dangerous beast, the blazing earth dragon. Exceptional sturdiness and great magic conductivity made earth dragon hides the standard materials to draw runes, useful at ranks 2 and below. The specific hide Stephen took out was even more exceptional than normal, able to perhaps make a rank 3 rune in the hands of a skilled runemaster. The hide had been tailored and processed exquisitely, evidently not Stephen's own work. At the middle of the hide was a complicated spell formation in the shape of a closed fist, exuding a savage aura. The lines and composition of the formation made it evident that the one who'd drawn it was quite proficient, and it was good by normal standards, but the shape was still somewhat crude. Since this was a formation that fused 3 smaller ones together, it required a precision and grasp of the big picture that could not be measured by ordinary standards. Although the formation wasn't complete, the occasional magic light flickering from several corners indicated that some parts of it were effective. Grand Mage Fair scanned the spell formation on the dragonhide for a while, nodding with slight surprise. Elementary strength, and it's about 20% complete. Not bad for your age and ability. This rune obviously has St. Claus style. Looks like he's quite attentive in coaching you. I'll have Luce study it when he gets back, and see how you can improve. Having said this, Fair passed the dragonhide to a student next to him and headed for the teleportation point. The old Grand Mage paused when he was next to Stephen, taking a long look at the young dragon warlock before saying, also, that dragonhide was pretty good. This is a bit of a waste. Escorted by a few students, Fair's figure disappeared into the rays of the magic formation. The skies were dark, and the wind was chilly. Yet to turn 18, and with the red dragon bloodline, drawing a complete rune would be the most important step in Stephen's lifetime as a runemaster. Once a rune crossed 10% completion, it was just a matter of time before he finished it. Even if he'd be stuck with elementary runes, he would definitely become a runemaster in the future. Stephen was still young, and definitely did not lack time. He'd assumed that this piece he'd spent most of the month toiling on, spending more than 1 million of the Solon family's gold coins to gather and process, would completely blow Professor Fair away. However, the response had only been lukewarm. Had this work been handed to St. Claus, he would sing the greatest of praises and compliments for it. On the other hand, Fair had remained indifferent and cold. It was like the Grand Mage had poured water from Flo Bay on Stephen's burning heart. Who was Luce? Stephen knew that Luce was Grandmaster Fair's student, someone who was 31 years old. He was a level 13 mage with no special bloodline, only average for his age. The work he'd labored over for a month had been tossed to a piece of mediocre trash? If Fair himself acted like this, it was easy to imagine how a legendary mage like Her Excellency would act. Stephen suddenly felt his heart turn cold, thinking of the dwindling income every month and feeling at a loss. Was it really so difficult to obtain the legendary mage's delight? What had gone wrong? Not considering Richard, even that piece of trash Randolph used to get a great amount before. Stephen didn't prize money, but he wanted the recognition and teachings of the legendary mage. What Sharon's delight showed was her attitude. If he couldn't even obtain that, how would he have the qualifications to become a legendary runemaster? It had been around half a year since he had come to the Deep Blue. In this time, Stephen had not been slacking off. He would make ample preparations for each meeting with the legendary mage, all with the intent to show her his most perfect side. Some of these meetings were placed in his schedule, while the chance encounters were created by using manpower and physical resources. The time he spent on learning magic and training was a lot greater than before, and the speed at which his mana grew was proof of his hard work. He'd done everything he should have, and also gone beyond what was required of him. For example, he'd done his utmost to deal with Richard, his largest competitor who'd been earmarked as a future Saint Runemaster. Unfortunately, Richard seemed to be walled in like a rock, leaving Stephen with no way to get to him. In all situations, Stephen would maintain the best manners and elegance as was becoming of the child of a great noble family. Even though there were times he wanted to punch someone's nose or tear one's clothes off, he knew the social construct of the Deep Blue extremely well. He understood how everything worked and knew the temper, habits, and likes of all the important people. He'd even succeeded in getting a group of friends, isolating his enemies. However, there was something a little off about the last point, because Richard had always been alone. However, after putting in the most effort he ever had in his life, Stephen had also gained the greatest disappointment in his life. Grandmaster Fair's nonchalance had completely woken him up. The Deep Blue was a tremendous and matchless monster, and he'd thought that he knew it well. However, he hadn't even seen its full appearance yet. In a place where so many grand mages gathered, a 17-year-old dragon warlock was nothing, even though he called himself a genius. There was no lack of people like him here. One of Fair's students was still in the lab, cleaning up the area. Seeing Stephen's pale and blank look, he suddenly felt some pity. Besides, he'd obtained quite a number of little gifts from Stephen. While not particularly rare, they represented Stephen's thoughtfulness. For someone from a noble family like Stephen, this was very rare. He greeted Stephen, looked to the left and right to check that nobody was around, and then whispered, "Professor is very busy today. Richard gave him a rune this morning, and he spent the entire morning testing its effects. His schedule is completely messed up." While the student's voice was gentle, the words were like thunder to Stephen's ears, to the point that he found himself almost unable to stand steadily. Richard? Rune? What rune? How complete was it? Stephen asked with a last trace of hope. His voice was hoarse, and purposefully unkempt hair grew completely disheveled. A few strands on went damp with sweat, sticking firmly to his forehead. However, he knew full well that any testable rune was far more complete than just 20%. However, he knew full well that a rune that could be tested meant that no matter how terrible it was, it still surpassed his 20% by a huge amount. The student gazed at Stephen with sympathy, pointing at the carcass of the armored horse in the distance that was being towed away by some strong men. It's elementary agility, and the completeness, that doesn't actually matter. See that armored horse? The rune has already been made into a rune slot. The experiment was a success, which means that this rune slot only needs a bit of tidying up and it'll be done. While he'd already prepared to hear this, the answer still surpassed Stephen's expectations. The rune had already been made into a rune slot, and the experiment had been a success? This was the second barrier on the path of becoming a runemaster, and that was placing a rune on the body of a particular being. However, Richard had easily passed this barrier. Stephen knew the significance of this very well. If one used the loosest of standards, Richard could now be considered a runemaster. This information smashed Stephen's bottom line. While there was still a long way to go till Richard could truly be a runemaster who could create rune knights, what was worse was that he had much more time than he did. Richard was only 12, and even if one were to say he was a year older than that, he would still only be 13. Everything suddenly turned dark in front of Stephen's eyes. All his hopes for the future, his glamour, his honor, it seemed to disappear in an instant. The huge investment his family had placed on him now only seemed cold and heavy. Stephen had borne witness to Randolph's plight, and even jeered at the boy before, but soon enough it could be him in that position. Stephen grabbed at the student's hand, and because he'd used too much strength, his fingernails sunk deeply into the other's flesh. With a hoarse voice he pressed on, "Are you sure it's Richard? Richard R. Sharon? That little guy who isn't even 13 yet." The student silently tore Stephen's hand away. He could understand how Stephen was feeling now and how he had lost his calm. Little Richard had given everyone a tremendous shock, to the point that even the Grand Mage Fair could not keep his calm, much less Stephen. The habits of the legendary mage had long since become an open secret, which was why students in the same field would always compete and even trample on each other. Each improvement from Richard meant delight from the big boss for all the mentors who had taught him. However, this was a huge blow to the rest of her students. With Richard's current achievement being so dazzling, the student couldn't even bear to imagine how great the blow to Stephen was. To be honest, there was nothing to imagine. Just the lost look on the face of this dragon warlock who had never lost his calm before was proof enough. Stephen was in no hurry to see what he had received, and just took out a little crystal bottle which he handed to the student as thanks. This was a potent mana potion, and although it was a small bottle it would fetch at least 500 coins on the market. This gift was extremely pleasing, and it was merely thanks for revealing this piece of news. With how intelligent Stephen was, he would definitely be giving a lot more in the future in exchange for what he'd just handed over. The student kept the little crystal bottle well, the cool, smooth and exquisite feeling from the bottle leaving him unwilling to move his fingers away. This was a day with great harvests for him. He'd witnessed the birth of a miracle, and obtained a little gift that was extremely pricey. There would even be more on the way. His mood only grew better, there was nothing more he could expect. Before stepping foot into the teleportation formation, the student could not help but look up at Flobé's skies, thinking that the weather that day was splendid. Stephen also looked up, but all that filled his sky was grey clouds. It was the omen of an incoming blizzard. Only Stephen and Minnie were left on the large viewing platform of the lab. Minnie was stood by the formation, and only when the strong men cleared the armored horse from the arena did she take a few steps closer to the railings to look attentively. She hadn't drawn close for Stephen's conversations with either Fair or his students. This shitty weather. Stephen cursed, unable to hold himself back. The beginning of spring was extremely cold in Flobé, and the chilly wind blew on his sweat-soaked clothes to make him feel like he'd fallen into an icy hole. He opened his palm and looked at what the student had given him, his expression even worse than before. This was a half-charred animal hide, obviously taken from a subspecies of some lizard. It was at least 4 grades worse than the blazing earth dragon he'd used, 1/1500th of the total price. The smart youth immediately understood the meaning of this. Richard's formation had been drawn on something that barely met the standards. Everyone knew that the better the material, the higher the success and efficiency of the magic formation. The half-charred fragment seemed incomparably heavy in Stephen's hands, difficult to even hold. There had always been a disparity between him and Richard in his mind, but because of this half-charred fragment, the distance had gotten even wider. Yet another gust of chilly wind blew, and Stephen's expression paled. He suddenly felt that he hated this place, the stupid weather, the stupid things, the stupid people. The only thing that he was satisfied with was that Grand Mage Fair had acted appropriately while speaking to him in front of his students, and had not gone too far. But what was the point? He'd already lost in general. What was the point of winning at trivial things then? Stephen waved his arms and signaled for Minnie to walk towards the teleportation formation, wanting to leave this place as soon as possible. Minnie suddenly asked nonchalantly, "What did he give you just now?" Stephen's body stiffened, and he gritted out, "A good piece of hide. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc. Please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 29. Secret Scheme. Deep in the night, Richard was in a dreamless slumber. Deep sleep allowed his fatigued body to recover slightly, and the powerful mana and energy potions concentrated the entire process. The Grey Dwarves had a popular saying in ancient times, "Time was money." However, that referred to the time of ordinary people, or those in secondary planes. For people like Richard or Sharon who came from primary planes, the worth of their time could not be measured in mere gold. Richard knew he had taken his first and most important step, something that gave him an exceptionally peaceful sleep. All the frustrations of his previous days had been vented by that armored horse, and the boy rested without realizing the extent of the shock his rune had on others and even the deep blue itself. Stephen's residence was bigger than Richard's, the building 3 levels taller. In the eyes of outsiders, this showed the value and affection Her Excellency had for the Dragon Warlock, and it was also a symbol of his identity as the child of a large noble family. However, only Stephen himself knew the price of maintaining this illusion. Richard's accommodations were completely free. On the other hand, he had to pay the full rent for this larger and more opulent residence. Even someone like Stephen, who had full support of the Solon family, was burdened by the nearly 300,000 coins he had to pay for this place's rent. On top of that, he paid twice the normal school fees. Although Duke Solon had paid off years of Stephen's education in one go, the costs of studying at the Deep Blue weren't that simple. Even without using special methods to calculate the monthly expenses, the huge rent on the residence alone was racking up a huge amount of interest. The resources of a large family like the Solon family couldn't be used on one person. The only reason he'd convinced his family to send him to the Deep Blue was that they wanted a rune master of their own blood. This was a desire any ambitious family on the continent held, and Randolph had wasted his chance like a fool before he could even begin. As a dragon warlock with the potential to become a rune master in the future, Stephen managed to gain even more resources than Randolph, and he'd begun to take part in matters related to his family in the past few years, showcasing his outstanding capabilities. However, the family expected a return on its investments. With Randolph as a precedent, they had limited patience, and Duke Solon would only use 2 or 3 years to consolidate his position as a legendary being before he began a large-scale expansion. Stephen also had to bear Minnie's fees. With the marriage established, Marquis Neil had been impatient to stop paying his daughter's fees. Things were getting tense on the front lines of the battle, and with the war affecting his own lands, it was a question whether he'd even be able to hold on until the end of the next year. Ultimately, this was because the Marquis men were too incompetent. Of course, Stephen added his own uncle into the list of useless people. That man had been charged with leading the reinforcements the Solon family had sent. Even with an absolute advantage in military strength, battling on familiar ground, their armies couldn't hold up against Alice. Forget crushing or surrounding her smaller army, they had yet to truly defeat her even once. This woman was extremely sharp when it came to the battlefield. Her tactics were erratic, and the moment she found the opponent's weak point, she would immediately strike like lightning, fierce and merciless. With less than a third the troops her opponent had, on a battlefield that was large and average in size, she'd sent the Allied forces running everywhere, tired to the bone. She looted Neil's fields, mines, forests, and towns, seizing all their resources. What she could not move she destroyed, leaving the Marquis heart bleeding and the man unable to fall asleep. The one-sided nature of it all had caused the surrounding noble families to grow restless. Solon's powerful intervention had cost him a corresponding amount, and with the war reaching a stalemate, most of the benefits Solon had gotten from Neil had disappeared. If this continued further, he would be facing a loss. Stephen's information said the family had already decided to make peace with Alice Arcaron if they couldn't take her out within a week. As for the compensation for this war, Neil would have to rack his brains. Stephen had kept his residence classy for the past half year, but now the sounds of utensils shattering rang out in the house. The elegant and intricate art pieces were smashed mercilessly into the walls or the ground, throwing fragments everywhere. Some shards even brushed past the youth's own face, leaving a few shallow bloody lines on him. The tangible and intangible weight on his shoulders was leaving him almost suffocated, and while smashing things could help him vent a little, that was only temporary. Still, venting was exactly what he needed right now, or he'd definitely go crazy. It's Arcaron. It's Arcaron again. They're a whole bunch of lunatics. Those devils should go to hell. Why are they here to obstruct my way? Stephen yelled and cursed as if he was delirious, but that still wasn't enough to calm the fury in his heart. However, there was nothing left to smash in the bedroom. The only thing remaining standing was an antique gold vase with crystals embedded in it, the most valued treasure of an emperor in another plane. Even ignoring its artistic value, if the superior purple crystals were removed from it and sold, they would definitely be worth over 1,000,000 gold coins. Stephen definitely couldn't bear the cost of such a treasure. This was actually a prized possession of the Duke's that he'd borrowed so he could show off. Stephen's anger did have a limit. He could smash up a number of items, but even if Richard were to kick his face in front of an audience, he wouldn't dare even touch this one. Minnie stood in the corner quietly, looking lonely yet beautiful. She was at an age where she was beginning to bloom, and her great figure and arrogant attitude only enhanced her youthfulness. However, her face and arms too had thin red lines on them. Stephen's anger had reached her as well. The flying shards did not discriminate. Looking at Minnie, Stephen felt his anger rise further. In his eye she was no beautiful girl or genius mage, instead a huge black hole for gold. Her fees were only a fifth of his, but it was definitely not a small amount. While her residence was not as large as Stephen or Richard's, it was not smaller than that of a regular Grand Mage. The house alone cost more than her school fees and rent. And all this didn't even include the amount she spent in training. It wasn't all that difficult for the Solums to support Minnie. However, with Stephen's own expenses reaching such an astounding number, the addition of hers would leave anyone breathless. Even a tiny stone could cause people to feel suffocated in a ship that was about to sink. Stephen knew full well that the amount of money Duke Solum had invested in him left no room for failure. All legendary beings had long lifespans, so the Duke would have no lack of heirs in his lifetime. Quite a few would be talented as well. From youth, Stephen's instructors had told him that he was no genius before he held true power. Countless geniuses were born each other, but only those with enough resources could actually develop themselves. Those without the talent could only possess an empty, glamorous title, and that too was only before they came of age. Once they grew up, they would truly be nothing, lesser even than the ordinary people. The glamour they'd experienced in their youths would only serve as trauma for their future lives. Randolph was the most recent example of this. Stephen thirsted for success, and was just as fearful of failure. The path he had walked had turned into one that headed straight into the abyss of hell, and retreating just one step would leave him only a horrible death. A mere dragon warlock was not deserving of such massive financial support. His social reputation also wasn't worth that much. In terms of his abilities in managing matters of the family, this old family that had continued over 100 generations had numerous managers. In actuality, in order to obtain the chance to study under Sharon and become a runmaster, not only had he used his family and Duke Solum's personal resources, he had also put in a lot of manpower and material power from his mother's side. Once the family chose to abandon him, he would be no better than those busy mages in the outer regions of the Deep Blue, focused solely on earning money. However, Richard loomed over this difficult path like the Augustine Mountains, God's heavenly moat. He'd acted of his own accord to marry Minnie, causing Duke Solum to have to pay even more. This couldn't actually be blamed on him. He was only doing things based on the laws of nobility. He'd made the right decision in that moment, the one most useful to his development in the future. It wasn't just his father's family, even his mother's and wife's side were extremely important resource. Who would have thought that Marquis Neil would be so shameless and heartless as to toss his outstanding daughter to the Solum family? Stephen practically pasted his face into Minnie's as he yelled, "You! Tell me what use you serve to me now. I'm paying so much for your fees every month, so tell me, how can you help? Are you helping improve my rune crafting, or in gaining me favors from Master? Tell me. That Richard has already left me far in the dust, what could I even do?" Seeing her stay silent, Stephen found it even more difficult to suppress his emotions as he snickered, "I almost forgot that you're a woman. At the very least, you can come to my bed. Now strip, and scram to the bed." Minnie did not argue, nor did she retaliate. She silently took off her clothes, lay on the bed, and spread her legs. Her expression was calm as she did this, but she turned her face to the side when she lay down to hide the tears leaking from her eyes. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the violent ravaging she'd expected didn't come. Hearing nothing even after a moment, she couldn't help but open her eyes again. She saw Stephen stood at the bed, holding a bottle of an alcohol bottle in hand as he took the occasional large swig. His gaze passed her body, instead settling on Flo Bay that was outside the window. The night view of the bay wasn't pitch black, the icicles always emitting strange glimmers with no sign of life. It seemed extremely desolate and cold. He looked at Minnie and said coldly, "You're a smart woman. Now isn't the time for you to show your temper or be stubborn. If I'm not successful in becoming a rune master, everything's over. Status, fame, money, power, I will have nothing. You should be aware of this fact. Marquis Neil has long since forsaken you, and your fate is now tied with mine. You should feel lucky, because large noble families with long histories like ours still prize official marriages. I don't have plans to invalidate the marriage yet. Right now, you need to do something about your future to prove your usefulness to me, the Solom family, and that you're worthy of the 500,000 gold coins that you spend monthly. If you can't do it, or don't want to, then I won't force you to do anything. Leave the Deep Blue the next month. I believe nobody would be willing to spend 500,000 gold coins on the daughter of a defeated marquis who's been used before. That's for every month." Stephen was slightly drunk by the end of it all, and his last words were bellowed out. Minnie stared up at the ceiling blankly, unmoving. Stephen had spoken the truth just now. Without the Solon family's financial support, it wasn't just her status that fell, she'd be put in a worse position than Aaron. Many men would want to leave something on the body of a former lady, and her talent with magic would grow insignificant at that point. Sharon had a saying, "There's ample geniuses in the world, it's gold that's finite." To be fair, Stephen was the one who'd invested his time into this wedding agreement. Minnie blinked in a moment, finally sitting up. Although her expression was still cold, the arrogance and ridicule in her eyes had died away. A smile of mockery rose about her lips, but this time, it was meant for herself. Her 2 feet touched the ground and, just like that, she stood by Stephen's side, gazing out of the window as he did. "I have nothing to be so proud of, but I can't give up on everything I have now. I choose to stand with you. You can treat me as a woman, a companion, a friend, or even a subordinate, but I won't be a toy." Stephen did not reply, merely narrowing his gaze on the wintry scene outside with a dangerous look. Minnie sighed and continued, "Don't you think this situation is strange? Richard's never learned how to make complete runes, while you're mentored by St. Claus and have top-notch materials to use. Even then it took you half a month with 41 failures to reach 20% completion, but Richard could make a full rune directly?" Minnie's words calmed Stephen down, and he began to consider, "You mean there's a possibility Richard didn't make the rune?" "No, there's no reason for Professor Fair to lie. He has no need to be biased towards either the Soloms or the Arcarans. Richard should have made it himself, but you're on the right track. His class schedule says he'll only begin learning runecrafting next year at the earliest, so there must have been some decisive factor that allowed him to break through this obstacle that so many never do in an instant, soaring so high. We need to find that key factor. Even if I can't use it, I could get some inspiration." Minnie frowned. "That's going to be difficult." "It is. Richard has practically no friends, and rarely has dealings with people not related to him. His greatest contact is with the grand mages who are his professors, but those guys are basically emotionless beings. This is the Deep Blue. I definitely can't stalk him to see who he makes contact with. Even buying information about his whereabouts will cause too much of a fuss." Stephen could not help but furrow his brows. Randolph's pitiful experiences fresh in his mid-malice towards another of her apprentices would not gain him Sharon's favor. "Aaron. We should just ask her. Who knows, we might just get an answer," Minnie suggested. "After all, she's the only woman to get so close to him." Stephen shook his head. "Aaron? What use is she? I thought she was someone Richard liked. Why else would the enforcers ban her from getting in bed with him? The only reason I had her first time was because I wanted to make Richard angered or dispirited, hoping he used some fierce methods in retaliation. As you can see, though, there's no effect at all. There's no change to Richard's studies and lifestyle, and there doesn't even seem to be a change in his emotional state. Is that liking someone? So much time has passed already, and Richard must have lost his interest in her. Why would he tell such an important secret to such an unreliable woman? The situation now is different as well. If Richard finds out about me and Aaron, it might even have the opposite effect. After all, those old guys are obviously on his side. Don't assume they're all confused geezers. Minnie was not of the same opinion. There's no harm in trying. Besides, you don't know how a woman thinks. Aaron likes him a little, which is why she will definitely not tell Richard what happened between you, or at least not the details. However, she definitely knows that she and Richard have no future. After being used by you, she's even more clear about that. Since there's no hope, why not use past feelings to earn some money? That's all, as long as this amount exceeds what she expected. All women living at the district at the edges are all the same. If she really could hold on, you wouldn't have been able to get her so easily. Stephen hesitated for a moment, and then nodded. However, he then sighed and said with a hint of disappointment, even if I were to find out the secret, the gap it's caused is hard to be compensated for. He might only be evaluated as excellent, but that doesn't mean everything. At the very least, the talent he's shown isn't much different from mine. On top of that, Stephen laughed wryly and continued, the resources he can use for his training far exceeds mine. Minnie went quiet. That was reality. Richard's monthly income was no large secret, and anyone with enough power could easily learn about it. His total income wasn't exactly ridiculous, but his expenses were far lower. Stephen used most of his money to pay for rent and fees for two, as well as other social costs. Removing all that, he didn't even have half as much to spend on courses, materials, and potions as Richard. Those were the true expenses that could affect one's improvements in magic. That elementary strength rune had already used up practically all his savings. Stephen took another huge swig of alcohol, allowing the liquid to burn its way from his throat to his chest. He could already feel that his efforts since entering the deep blue had gone awry. He used to believe he'd used the perfect schemes, both openly and in the shadows, using Aaron to cause trauma and seizing every possible moment to isolate his opponent. Using all his resources, he would then show his talent and strength in becoming a rune master. However, the result had dealt him a damning blow. Using progress that exceeded his own by 2 large grades, Richard had won a battle that hadn't even been declared. Stephen could not help but begin to reflect on whether he had done too many useless things. Had he used the entirety of his energy and focus on runecrafting from the start, would the result have been different? Deep Blue was not like the outside world. There was no need to butter up the public, no need for status. All that was required was Sharon's delight and absolute power. Minnie gazed at the crestfallen face of the ambitious man next to her, suddenly feeling a chill on her naked body. Even her heart began to squeeze, and the humiliation she'd felt but moments ago gave way to freezing cold. Even if Stephen gave up now, he still had his bloodline and the connections from his mother's side. What did she have? Minnie hesitated for a long time, and then said, there might be a last option, though it might not work. What is it? Stephen's eyes brightened as he asked, like a drowning person who'd suddenly found some flotsam. Get close to Master, and obtain her favor. I've been feeling lately like she's grown increasingly unstable, so this is a very good opportunity. While she's a legendary mage, she's also a woman. Stephen froze for a while, and soon understood what Minnie was implying. His eyes began to brighten up. Yes, the legendary mage was a woman. Why hadn't he thought of that? As expected, women understood women the best. So you're saying that I should try making Sharon mine? Stephen wondered, his expression slowly gaining life again to reveal the flawless smile of nobility once more. Although he lost completely in runecrafting, he had an absolute advantage over Richard in this area. It wasn't such a rare thing among aristocrats, nothing to blush over. This was another type of battle, but its stakes were no less than any other. Determination flashed in Stephen's eyes. That is a method, but the rate of success is minute. I can't place my hopes on that. There are a few more people I can use in the deep blue. If it's absolutely necessary, I'll make that kid disappear. If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 30. Tender and delicious. Time passed without anyone paying attention, and gigantic cracks began to form on the ice sheets north of Flow Bay. Spring had arrived, a season where the many magical beasts began to mate from gophers to dragons. Everyone by Sharon's side could sense that Her Excellency was growing extremely strange. Her emotions were starting to fluctuate without pattern, like those of a little girl with a rabbit's heart. The grand mages in contact with her grew extremely cautious, paying attention to her every thought. Even someone like Fair had to grow prudent. Some people guessed that these were the stirrings of love, and the grand mages who had vast experience knew that beasts were most dangerous in breeding season. The afternoon sun was shining brightly, and the legendary mage was laid lazily on her couch as she pondered something so hard she'd even forgotten to eat her favorite fruits from beside her. She was dressed casually, the soft ivory-colored silk gown sticking to her like a second skin. A pair of bare little feet were rested high on another armrest, her tender skin revealing a gentle luster akin to a pearl under the warm sunlight. This was a pair of bare feet that was extremely tempting. The tiny bit of calf they revealed enough to make the ignorant do all they could to imagine the scene deeper between those legs. However, no ignorant people could stay by the legendary mage's side. They all chose to disregard the spring radiance Sharon exuded, no stray thoughts in their minds. Most of the people here had followed Sharon through battles from plane to plane, while the rest had taken part in the creation of the deep blue. They all knew her terrifying methods very well, and in their eyes the person reclining in front of them wasn't a little woman who was so tender one couldn't resist the urge to take a bite of her. No, she was a true, ancient, dragon. Anyone without this awareness had long since disappeared into the planar storms. The mages made their reports as per usual, but Sharon herself was obviously lazy and disinterested. Her eyes were even flickering shut. At this moment, a servant walked in, saying that a great master in art had come to seek an audience with Her Excellency. Sharon's narrowed eyes did not move for a long while, and only when the servant was almost unable to keep this half-bowed pose and began to send helpless looks to the grand mages did she lazily nod. The maestro then approached her fearfully, artwork in hand. As someone without the qualifications to attend a meeting with so many higher-ups, he'd never had such a feeling before. When his gaze shifted to Sharon's shining bare feet, everyone saw the master's throat move. Tens of blade-like piercing gazes immediately caused him to become aware that he had forgot his manners, and cold sweat immediately covered his body. Thankfully Her Excellency had not opened her eyes, instead still looking dazed as if she was thinking about something. She hadn't even noticed the rudeness and strong physical reaction of the artist. The maestro came to the couch and bowed his head down, not daring to let his gaze land on any part of Sharon's body. He revealed the work he was hugging tightly to his chest, and then said with respect, "Your Excellency, your student Stephen has made a portrait for you. It has great artistic value, which is why I was so bold as to take some of your precious time to hand it to you." Sharon's narrowed eyes finally opened completely, and she began to focus. She was like a cat sunbathing as she shifted her body lethargically to look at the portrait from a better angle. The legendary mage had many pupils, and she had also obtained all sorts of strange gifts before. However, Stephen was the first to give her a portrait. This was a half-body portrait, the background being of Flow Bay during summer. The foothills of the Everwinter Mountains had been dyed a tender green, the peaks still covered with snow year-round. The background seemed like peppermint milk, a famous dessert in Norland. The sea was tranquil and deep, while the skies seemed lofty. Various shades of blue filled the space between them, with the legendary mage at the center. Sharon was dressed in her favorite sky blue robes, leaning against a parapet wall and staring into the distance. This truly was a masterpiece. There was no lack of portraits of the legendary mage, even once done by accomplished masters. However, all of them accentuated her identity as a legendary mage. While they would express her beauty, it was all centered around dignity and magnificence. Earlier works sketched out the scene where she battled on other planes, showing both her beauty and her cold-killing intent alongside the power that caused others to bend their heads. This half-body portrait displayed originality, and in this work she seemed more like a beautiful woman with a graceful temperament. The background of the painting was in blue, green, and white, the purest, most tender and sweetest of the palette. They had all been handled quite well too, none obscuring the focus. If not for that robe that only Sharon wore, it would be difficult to tell that the indistinct and dispirited woman was actually a legendary mage. The half-body portrait was ingenious. They revealed Stephen's thoughts in their entirety, yet remained ingeniously vague. Sharon's eyes finally twitched slightly, and the maestro noted the slight change. Having once wandered through many kingdoms, mixing with courts and aristocrats, he had been a lady killer himself. Be it young or old, he'd seen the look in Sharon's eyes many times before. Indeed. All these years people only remembered that Sharon was a legendary mage, keeping in mind her powerful magic, wealth, and growing prosperity that could be compared to groups of dragons. Everyone forgot she was a woman. Although the lives of legendary beings were very long, their state of mind would change with time. With time, they would age as per usual, then feel young again, then change again. At the end was indifference. The high-grade elves on the Norland continent had once had this glamour, and had a profound understanding and recounting of this. Sharon had long since entered the legendary realm, but she was still in the same state of mind as an 18 or 20-year-old. It was hard to tell, but the haziness in her eyes was something the maestro had seen in many young women dreaming of love. The painting had evidently had great effects. Once, in the past, the art master had been taken in by Sharon's beauty and might, willing to give up on the colorful world outside and settle in the deep blue. However, that one-sided admiration had been dulled by time. Love needed a real basis, and once he started taking money from Sharon to maintain his lifestyle, his distant hopes quickly disappeared. He felt no jealousy at Stephen's wishes. All that hard work only brought to mind the memories he thought he'd sealed away. As he pondered over them, all he could feel was sadness, a sign of age. 10 years ago, helping Stephen with this would have been unthinkable even if it gave him a huge amount of gold. Perhaps startled by the art master's gaze, Sharon suddenly opened her eyes completely. Her eyes were completely clear, shocking the master into lowering his head. The legendary mage greedily took a look at the half-body portrait that Stephen had drawn, and then beamed brightly. This was drawn quite well. Am I actually so beautiful, though? Of course. You are the most beautiful of all legends. The maestro seized the opportunity to say this before all the other grand mages. Sharon chuckled reservedly, and then turned to the grey dwarf, Blackgold. Little Stephen isn't half bad. How about this, add a little of my delight for him this month. As for the amount, Having said this much, Sharon suddenly saw the art master still rooted to the spot in a daze. You should leave. All sorts of thoughts in his mind, the maestro didn't dare linger in the place. Knowing that Sharon would give Stephen some of her delight was enough. That piece of news would bring the youth enough joy to net even more benefits. On the way towards the teleportation point, the maestro suddenly slowed his footsteps. He was shocked at how he'd changed. Since when had he grown so philistine as to help a young noble he was not familiar with pursue someone he liked? Was it just for the money? The man began to struggle in his mind, and a voice told him practically all grand mages were fighting for Sharon's delight. Wasn't that all for gold? If all the great mages did that, then what did a little mage like him have to boast about? However, rationality and experience ruthlessly reminded this maestro that the two scenarios were different. All the grand mages had their own bottom lines, they contributed to the deep blue in their own ways to receive the rewards they did. Sharon's delight definitely did not come out of nowhere, it was a show of acknowledgement for their achievements and hard work. These grand mages who had aged all viewed Sharon as they would a cute little girl, willing to joke around with her. Of course, there were also people working only for gold, but the common trait between them was that they were loyal to their work. Every gold coin that they earned was earned with a clear conscience. Someone with no principles definitely could not survive by the legendary mage's side. With this thought, the Archmaster immediately felt that the gold coins and magic crystals in his pocket were beginning to heat up. He could not help but wonder if it was this self-defeatist attitude that didn't let him create a work he was truly satisfied with in years. In the meeting hall, Sharon continued to stare at the portrait after the maestro left. There was a complicated look evident in her eyes that caused the grand mages to exchange glances of worry. Stephen's meaning was obvious, and they weren't afraid that Sharon didn't understand it. However, she was acting very strangely now, which left them uneasy. Could this legendary mage be so foolish as to be touched by this shrewd young person? A while later, Black Gold couldn't endure it anymore and coughed a few times. Getting Sharon's attention, the Grey Dwarf spoke in a loud voice, "Your Excellency, you haven't decided on Stephen's reward for this month." Sharon heard the Grey Dwarf's unusual tone, but her eyes were still fixed on her portrait as she said nonchalantly, "Just 100 gold coins is enough." "This, how much?" This was the first time that the Grey Dwarf found himself doubting his ears. Watching how taken the legendary mage was with the portrait, even 1,000,000 wouldn't have shocked him as much as this. The legendary mage finally peeked out from behind the portrait, answering in annoyance, 100. "Have I not made myself clear? How much more do you want to give? Are you going to pay for it?" "Oh no, of course not. You're joking here. How could I have the money?" The Grey Dwarf hastily rose his hands, frightened. The Grey Dwarves and the dragons had similar likes. Gold was not a currency for him, but a collectible item where more was better. Getting him to give up his money was just as painful as cutting off his beard. The legendary mage's little nose wrinkled as she hummed, "That's fine then. Also, give that guy who just left 10,000. This was drawn well, and he's improved quite a lot. He needs to be rewarded." Black Gold could not understand why Sharon was gazing at the portrait Stephen had given her, yet said that she wanted to reward the Archmaster. A few grand mages seemed to be deep in thought. Based on how familiar they were with each other, they exchanged gazes and then nodded slightly. Of course, nobody thought of clearing up the confusion of the Grey Dwarf who lacked a single artistic bone in his body. However, Sharon had no intentions of hiding anything. She waved the portrait in her hands around. "Look, the composition and fundamental colors all have that guy's style, and only the portrait, layering of colors and details are different. It's obvious that he made the base sketch and Stephen only colored a little on top." What kind of expression did you show just now? Did you really think I couldn't tell? I'll remember this. Be careful of your salary next month. And you, Black Gold, it's about time you learn art. Don't just focus on money." The Grey Dwarf nodded hard. "Rest assured, Your Excellency. I will definitely study hard. The next time I participate in the Sacred Tree Empire's treasure meet, I'll definitely get a few renowned works that will rise in value." Sharon's gaze returned to the portrait of herself, and she took a few more looks before sighing. "Actually, seeing this only urged me to make a decision." "All right, enough of that. Is there anything else from you?" Fair took a step forward and reported Richard's studies with Naya in detail. At the very mention of the young man, Sharon's eyes brightened, and she cut in before Fair could even finish. No wonder Richard's made a breakthrough in runes. So this guy has been interfering. Professor Fair, do you think he will be a negative influence on Richard? Fair had long since pondered over this question and shook his head. No, he might be beneficial to Richard's future. Sharon's eyes immediately glinted dangerously. "Someone is thinking of putting their hands on my Richard?" Fair hastily said, that's not what I mean. We know that Richard will become a rune master in the future, and it's rare for rune masters to avoid the battlefield. Learning a few dark arts will be useful for his survival. The legendary mage then nodded, that's true. However, Naya's actually secretly teaching my apprentice without my permission. He's still as gutsy as he was back then. The Blade of Calamity was extremely annoying. I wanted to give him a lesson he would remember, but that guy actually didn't care about his reputation and holed up like a little mouse. I left him be, but who knew he was actually hiding inside the deep blue? Ishum, good, very good, hee hee hee. When the legendary mage's laughter began to sound strange, all of the grand mages went quiet. Naya was truly gutsy to dare hide in the deep blue even after offending Sharon. It had to be said that this was both a great surprise and a good idea. However, now that his identity was made public, it would be too late even if he were to leave the deep blue immediately. Sharon might not be the most powerful legendary, but she was the one who held the most grudges, which was why her tracking and hunting abilities were just as well known as her magic. Nobody really minded the Blade of Calamity's identity as a killer. All kinds of people came to the Deep Blue, the flow of residents at the borders comparable to the capital of a small country. Who knew how many of the people living here had once worked in the shadows to survive? As long as they followed the Deep Blue's own laws, nobody would care about their pasts. The Deep Blue only upheld their own laws, and the rules in the outside world did not matter in here. Sharon gritted her teeth and said, slightly vexed, while the Blade of Calamity offended me before, those were trivial matters now that I think about it. I did also look through his personal treasures decades before. It's been so many years, so forget it. He's tactful, though, because he's teaching Richard the real things and hasn't hidden anything. That makes it a little difficult to handle this. At this moment, the Grey Dwarf took a step forward and reminded her, Your Excellency, taxes. What? Sharon froze. It had to be said that her reactions were rather slow these days. Your Excellency, Naya isn't paying his taxes. He takes 1,000 gold coins worth of fees from your Richard every day but doesn't pay taxes. That's plain stealing gold coins from you. The Grey Dwarf became more agitated as he spoke, beginning to wave his arms around to emphasize what he was saying. The legendary mage's beautiful eyebrows lifted. To some extent, she and the Grey Dwarf had similar interests, and that was money. She quickly got up, exclaiming, Black gold. Go get Naya and all the taxes he owes me. Bring a few more people, he always has companions around. The Grey Dwarf immediately straightened his back and, like an ape, began to thump his chest hard while yelling, There's no need. I can go myself. This is the Deep Blue. He seemed like a true warrior as he took big strides out of the room, his vigor matching that of a rune knight preparing to charge. However, the Grand Mages were indifferent to this all. Having worked together for almost a decade, they knew that the Grey Dwarf would definitely call for a dozen enforcers before he had the guts to cause trouble for the Blade of Calamity. The discussion ended there. After the Grand Mages all left, Sharon stared at this work for a very long time, and then got a servant to call Richard over. The place where Richard and the legendary mage met was a small hall that was decorated in an elegant and warm manner, rather than those 1,000-meter-long large halls that created a distance akin to that of mountains and rivers. The legendary mage had worn some long clothing atop her silk robe, with a collar covering her neck embedded with flowery patterns. It caused her little face to seem even younger and more beautiful. Her long hair had now become incredibly messy, and she bundled up with 2 dragon teeth. A few stray strands still fell on her rounded shoulders, however, seeming exceedingly enticing. When Richard entered, the legendary mage was kneeling on a dark red carpet made of pure fur. Half her body was spread out over the mahogany coffee table, as she stared at a little golden magic scale in front of her eyes. At the 2 ends of the scale were standard weights of different sizes. The scale was already imbalanced, the pan on the right practically touching the chassis, and Sharon was playing with an intricate little weight in her left hand, hesitating over where she should put it. This was a very small weight, tinier than any of those on the table, and looked like wherever it was placed, it would not have a decisive effect. However, Richard soon astutely noticed the faint aura of magic emanating from the coiled dragon and demon carved on the pillar, and immediately realized that this was a magic scale. It was balanced not just based on the weight of the items, but the amount of magic within the item. It was also very sensitive to the surroundings and would react to the erratic elemental energy in the plane, which affected the balance. Hence, it could be a tool to test the quality of magic in items, and also to divine the future. Richard stood silently and did not disturb her. He liked this sort of silence, and also liked the shocking charm that the legendary mage was unwittingly giving off. Sharon, on the other hand, only noticed him standing there after a long time. She turned to give him a glance, murmuring tender and delicious, before she tossed the weight to the pan that was sticking high up on the scale. Clang! The sound of magic gold was extremely crisp, and took a long time to disappear. The little weight seemed to be as heavy as a mountain, pressing the pan all the way down to the bottom. Sharon looked at Richard, then at the scale, and back at Richard. She repeated this a few times, her expression strange. If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 31. Deep Blue Aria. Every year, on the last day of April, Norland's 7 moons would hang side by side in the beautiful night sky. This day was said to be a life-changing moment for many, and was known as the Day of Destiny. The Day of Destiny was a festival celebrated by many countries on the continent, and was also common with many less intelligent tribes, especially those who practiced magic. It was said that this was a day when all the gods would hear the voices of their followers, sending spokespeople or even transforming into mortal forms themselves as they roamed the streets to listen to their people. The devout would receive rewards, while the unbelievers would end up empty-handed. Only those who'd crossed planes knew that folklore would remain folklore. Nonetheless, there truly were many life-changing things on that fateful day. Alice's rune knights had broken through the combined ranks of Solom and Neil in a brilliant ambush, counter-attacking the rune knights of the combined army. 20 against 18, the disadvantage to her, she'd lost only 5 knights to wipe out her opponents completely. This was a battle that would decide the standing of both parties. Viscount Alice had put her knights on the front lines, piercing through her opponent's defenses like a hot knife through butter. A large opening was made into their steel defense, only growing larger as the battle finally concluded with her victory. Tens of thousands of men were enslaved, and about 1,000 cavalry had been lost as well. The Solom family announced their withdrawal from the battle, while Neil sent an ambassador almost immediately to start peace talks. Military law from ancient times dictated that any peace talks were determined by the outcome of the battle just prior. Marquis Neil ended up losing over a third of his territory in exchange for 10 years of peace, giving Alice the land she needed to become an earl. The only thing left was the Sacred Alliance Emperor's decree. The battle between the Rune Knights resulted in both victory and losses, but the talk of the public was of course about the huge difference in the strength of both parties, which was the main reason for Alice's victory. They would start guessing at the enigmatic runemaster under Alice from then. Whoever it was, they far exceeded the famous Saint Claus. Alice may have been a hot topic in the southwest of the Sacred Alliance, but even more people on the continent were discussing Gatton. On the Day of Destiny, Gatton Archaron had chosen to enter the capital of the Sacred Alliance, the city of legends Faust. The road to Faust has always been paved by metal and blood. Many tried to hinder the path of visitors, both openly and in the dark. Some just sent men to kill the new entrants directly. This was all a rule the first emperor implemented, now a tradition of the Sacred Alliance. People without the ability to break through the defenses and live through ambush after ambush had no right to step into the city of legends. It was also deemed legal for anyone to attack the territories of anyone entering Faust. This was something that had been passed down for hundreds of years. Behind the glory of everyone who managed to enter Faust was a road filled with roses and bloodshed. People often only remembered the ones who succeeded, not those who disappeared along the way. Gatton's decision had evoked many discussions in the continent. The Arcarans had obtained the power to challenge Faust long ago, but they had never had the unity to do it. As chief, Gatton could only represent himself. Moreover, he was rising too quickly, which in the eyes of the older royals was not a good thing. They thought that he lacked foundation, a word which meant many things in contest. Secret and private planes, never-ending wealth, mature rune knights, well-equipped elite troops, and talents that could be further improved. All this took time, a lot of it. A lack of foundation why upstarts fell quickly, and in their eyes Gatton was without doubt a very stupid upstart. The road to Faust was not a smooth one for Gatton Arcaran, but he was not like the other families before him who brought all their troops to break through the defenses. Instead, he did the complete opposite. All his soldiers across various planes were stationed where they were to prevent invasions, and even his authority as family chief wasn't made use of. When Gatton Arcaran set off on his journey, he only had 13 rune knights with him. It was thus shocking to the entire Sacred Alliance that he appeared before the entrance of Faust right on time at noon. This was the first time any Arcaran had stepped foot into Faust, and it also signified that from this day onwards, the Arcarans would become one of the most influential families in the continent. The Day of Destiny was special for Richard, as well. At 11 in the night he was called to meet Sharon, and his gut told him this meeting would be a special one. As night fell upon the beautiful Flow Bay, the deep blue was brightly lit. Waves of what looked like blue smoke flowed out of various parts of the tower, ascending its sides. From afar, it looked like an elegant and mysterious blue crystal tower stood high on the far end of Flow Bay. The land around the deep blue had thousands of bonfires lit and burning fiercely, making it seem like a starlit sky if one looked down from above. The people didn't seem to feel the chilly spring as they gathered around the bonfires, singing, dancing, drinking, and admiring the once-a-year lighting of the deep blue. Most of these people lived on the outskirts, and the deep blue was an asylum to them that served as a pillar of strength. As long as the deep blue stood tall, their pride would never cease. Yet on this night of celebration, the deep blue itself was dead quiet. The Grand Mages had long since grown indifferent to the event, having seen bigger celebrations in the past. To them, the world of magic was already endless. There was no need to numb and lose oneself through these meaningless celebrations and festivals. It was time for Richard to see Sharon. The huge magic puppets opened the heavy metal doors before Richard, revealing the spiral staircase that led up. Designed according to the liking of the higher-ups of the deep blue, the doors were tall and simple, a deep red ochre with a natural veiny pattern. This primitive beauty reminded one of the origin, a savage wasteland of destruction and despair. The stairs were fine and delicate, radiating light everywhere. At first look it seemed like nothing, but anyone who stared at the radiance would immediately feel dizzy and confused until they couldn't make out what material they were made of. The statues on the handrails were all intoxicating, standing out even more under the dim light as mesmerizing works of art. The height of the stairs made Richard dizzy. This was already the highest region of deep blue, and any higher would mean Sharon's personal area. Even the Grand Mages had no rights to enter that. The legendary master wanted to see him in her personal region? Richard calmed his mind down, slowly walking up a flight of stairs. An openwork door that was made of all sorts of shapes opened itself on its own to welcome him, revealing 2 dark elves behind it. Seeing the underground race that was legendary for its ferocity appear before him, he almost instinctively cast a spell, but then he reminded himself that this was Sharon's private territory and it was impossible for there to be enemies here. The Dark Elves were likely subordinates she'd raised in private. The drow clearly knew Richard, and one of them made a gesture of invitation. "Mr. Richard, please, come with me." She then led him on as the other one closed the door. Watching the silent footsteps of the drow in front of him, fine beads of perspiration suddenly dotted Richard's entire body. Naya had once taught him to observe other people's movements. Every step of this girl's was as precise as the movements of a pendulum, no greater and no less than the width of her shoulders. The girl brought Richard into a very vast space. If Sharon's kilometer-long reception hall used for discussing business simulated an environment of mountains and rivers, then this huge space of nearly 100,000 square meters would be a copy of every dimension of the natural environment. There was lava, polar snow, coniferous forests, dry deserts, moist and muddy swamps. There was even a dragon's nest here. The different regions were separated by magical barriers, each not affecting the others. Every environment seemed alive, with magic barriers of various attributes flickering with shadows of purple, green, blue, and many other colors. The shadows zoomed across the landscape, their movements so quick one could barely recognize that they were strange creatures moving about that could only be seen in bestiaries. They passed through this area, then followed a flight of steps up another level to another door. This one was made of stone, and except for its surface being polished smooth, there was nothing particularly odd about it. The girl made a light stroke on the door and it opened silently, before she refused to take another step as she signaled Richard to enter by himself. At the end of the long, deep passageway was a dreamlike place. Numerous ice crystals were embedded on the walls here, and stars littered the dome-like sky. They emitted a blue radiance of varying brightness, painting everything in the room a fantastic blue. The floor was bright and clean like a mirror, made of an unknown material. It didn't at all feel cool to the touch, instead being warm and comfortable to walk on. Just like a mirror, it reflected the starry sky, making Richard feel like he was in the center of a galaxy looking at an endless sea of stars. In the distance was a wall of French windows, displaying a panoramic scene of the ever-winter mountains under the night sky. The tall, magnificent mountain range was like an ancient titan, majestic and solemn as it lay there witnessing the changes of history without participating at all. A graceful figure was stood in front of these 10-meter-tall windows, almost undetectable in this dreamlike space. However, even if he hadn't noticed her at the start, his gaze locked onto her the moment he did, unable to shift away. This was the legendary mage Sharon, the conqueror of plains, the dragonslayer, and the demon killer. Such a place, such a time, and such a woman. It all combined together to make Richard feel like he was in a dreamland, but also like he'd entered another person's memories. His body and mind experienced the vicissitudes of time, as if he'd been on an expedition for more than thousands of years in this plane. Richard eventually suppressed his peculiar emotions, stepping forward to ask, "You were looking for me, master?" The legendary mage slowly turned around, staring at him as she said, "You're already a man, Richard, and you've displayed your talents and abilities." Her expression and aura were different from usual right now. She looked like a gentle, dignified woman, but also like a young lady who hadn't yet lost her youth. She paused for a faint moment before asking, "Are you willing to continue on with my knowledge, advancing on the path of runecrafting?" Richard's heart jumped as he bowed. "Yes, I am." Sharon laughed as she replied gently, "You know, everything comes at a price. Until now, all of that price was paid by your father, Gatton Sharon. But I know that is not what you want, so I am offering you a chance for you to use yourself as the price in exchange for greater power. Do you accept?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Sharon had been casual, but he had to wonder what exactly he had that could compare to his father's financial aid. Even if he hadn't known originally, he now knew what 10 years of Norland time and profit from a plane was. Even if he sold his very life away, he wouldn't be able to beat that sum. Richard was a smart boy, and his own intellect alongside what he'd learned in the Deep Blue allowed him to recognize his own value clearly. Even 10 of the current him wouldn't be enough to nurture a runemaster, and as for the future, even to attain Gatton's current achievements, he'd need both unrelenting effort and a modicum of luck. Just like Professor Fair had said, luck had always been an important part of one's strength, perhaps the most important part. That was a cruel truth, but it was the truth nonetheless. Everyone had their value, and no matter how one insisted that they couldn't be measured in gold, others would decide for them. There would always be a huge difference between one's perceived value of oneself and their true value, so he couldn't make such a promise before he knew the extent of his own achievements in the future. But Richard could tell from the words of Sharon that she was biased. This made him hesitate even more, because deep down he knew that he already owed her so much. He would put shame the values Elena taught him if he continued to desire more and not think about whether or not he could return all these favors. The haughtiness of Elena, unique to Silver Moon elves, had been passed down to him. The only reason he hadn't rejected outright was the flames burning deep down in his heart. If he rejected Sharon's help, Richard wasn't sure if he could get enough resources elsewhere to become stronger and fulfill his mother's last wish. His father was a huge shadow towering over him, and this shadow was still expanding infinitely. He'd never thought a choice could be so hard. Sharon walked before Richard and caressed his face, making him raise his head. This was the first time they'd made contact, and he realized the legendary mage's hand was so cold that it caused him to shiver. But Richard realized as they stood facing each other, that they were actually about the same height. Demons were far taller than humans, while the Silver Moon elves were also a head taller on average. With the bloodlines of both as well as his childhood spent in the mountains, he was far taller than peers of his age. The breadfruit he ate for the first 10 years of his life was actually an ancient elven prescription, while Sharon had spent a bomb on specially curated meals for him this past year. At this point he was the size of a normal youth. The face of the legendary master looked so gentle at such a near distance, encouraging him to say what was on his mind. "Master, I have nothing equivalent to your nurture. The future is still far away, who knows what would happen in 3 years' time?" Sharon let out a tender laugh, and even the magic radiance-filled room could not overpower the glistening of her eyes. "So you were worrying about that? Stubborn little thing, you're just like your mother." Richard was really taken aback this time round. "You know Mother?" "I saw her twice, and we could be counted as good friends. Elena was someone that deserved respect, and your personality is a copy of hers, so I thought of her. But her and your father. Forget it, those were things in the past, let's not talk about them. I just want to let you know that I can guess bits of what you're thinking right now." Her voice was calm and gentle, but it easily cracked through the walls of Richard's fiercely guarded heart. He could only lower his head, trying to prevent Sharon from seeing the tears rolling down his face. "Elena is part of the reason I'm offering you a chance like this, but another part is me giving myself some hope, to try and achieve a dream I never thought possible. Sometime earlier, I was in a hopeless despair, but your appearance has given me a glimmer of hope. So you don't have to think about what you can give in return, giving your all is enough." That eliminated all of Richard's hesitation. "I accept. As long as I live, I'll dedicate my life." Sharon cut him off, covering his mouth as she laughed. "That's unnecessary. The first 2 words were all I wanted to hear. All right, little Richard, it's time for you to see a real magic rune." Sharon took a few step backs, light as water without any gestures or spells. It was like she lost all mass as she ascended into the sky, only stopping once she reached a meter of height. She spread her arms gracefully like a swan, and her magic robes as well as all her clothes turned into a million rays of light dancing around her. Richard was shocked beyond words. Never in his life had he thought he would see such a dreamlike body without anything covering it, and his master's body was more breathtaking than he'd thought. By the time he recovered from his shock, blue lines were running all along Sharon's body, like branches with a life of their own as they spread throughout her body before shining suddenly with a faint blue light. Richard's mind blanked out, filled only with this beautiful blue as his train of thought ground to a halt. He couldn't think anymore. This beauty before him was beyond words, no, beyond everything. Sharon's voice came lightly, like it was something that was not of this world. "Did you see that? This is a rune unique to me, the deep blue aria. It isn't complete yet, and I thought I wouldn't be able to complete it in my lifetime, but now I'm willing to give myself some hope. Richard, if it's possible in the future, complete it for me. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 32. A Radiant Trauma. Richard approached her subconsciously, each step feeling like he was in dreamland as the light seemed about to brush against his face. He raised his arm to touch the dancing blues, but his fingers just passed through the magnificent color and left him touching Sharon's body straight on. The point of contact seemed to explode with the might of a legendary spell, causing both Richard and Sharon to tremble involuntarily. So in awe of the beauty and mystery of the deep blue aria was he that he could not even express himself right now with words or senses. He found that roiling blood gushing into his body once more, the most powerful it had ever been, and this time it could not be stopped. It engulfed his frozen consciousness once again. His hand couldn't help but explore further, instinctively wandering up along the legendary mage's glistening thighs. At that moment, Richard suddenly felt like he'd awakened a volcano. A rumble sounded as Sharon seemingly ignited like a torch, blue flames spurting out to form a depthless azure around her. She gritted her teeth and lifted Richard up in one go, boundless mana surging into his body. Richard himself began to emit an elemental storm that tore his clothes apart before turning them to dust. With a bang, Richard was thrown to the ground. The surface was extremely hard, and the impact was strong, but with all the mana Sharon had poured into him racing through every cell, he felt no pain at all. However, the strong impact still numbed his limbs, leaving him unable to get up right away. The legendary mage's mana had not been able to suppress Richard's berserking bloodline, and even as he lay down, the mark of a mature male pointed sideways, aimed at her. "Damn it!" Sharon gritted out, moving 10 meters in an instant to appear above him before she shot straight down. She pulled a blue band of the light around her, forming gigantic wings that covered most of the room. These wings were radiant, unwilling to dissipate so easily. Richard's body rose instinctively, welcoming this dazzling and ambiguous temptation as a bestial roar was shot out of his throat. He suddenly felt a certain part of his body enter a mysterious region, dark, wet and powerful, and each powerful thrust seemed to bombard his nerves with a crushing sensation. He couldn't help but howl, retaliating by sheer instinct as he placed his hands on her thighs and, grabbing tightly, doing all he could to head deeper and deeper in. Sharon's tightly furrowed brows first began to relax, before they finally rose. On that fated night, as the deep blue dreamt, a boy became a man. 7 moons hung high in the sky, dyeing the night 7 different colors as many people's fates were altered. Even the most special of days pass, however, and the day of destiny was no different. Morning light shone on Richard's body to slowly wake him up. A new day had come. He found Sharon still there, lying in a deep sleep. Her body seemed flawless under the morning sun, shining with an ivory luster. The 2 reddish bumps at her chest seemed to sense Richard's gaze, beginning to tremble slightly. The azure patterns from the night before had already disappeared from her body, and everything seemed to be but a dream. Everything was perfect, but their bodies were positioned oddly. Richard's body was curled up, and his head rested in the curve of Sharon's arm. His arms and legs were over hers, as if he was afraid she would escape, or as if he lacked a sense of security and independence. The legendary mage, in contrast, was lying down casually with her right arm around him as she slept in satisfaction. Mornings were normally the time when men had the most energy, and as he began to recall the events of the previous night, Richard couldn't control himself at the sight of the sleeping Sharon. His hands began to move, but the tiny movements immediately awakened the legendary mage. Sharon stretched out lazily, and then crisply slapped away the hand that was wiggling all over her body. She then unwillingly opened her eyes, feeling extremely uncomfortable as something hot and hard moved as it pressed into the side of her buttocks. She grabbed it by instinct and gave it a ring, causing Richard to let out a groan. The legendary mage turned and opened her eyes, her gaze gradually brightening to let Richard know she was truly awake. She didn't seem the least bit surprised to find him lying next to her, first covering her mouth to yawn a couple of times before she stretched for a while. Richard could only continue moaning. Even as Sharon moved, his right hand was still on his member. On top of that, the scene before him made his nose want to bleed, and he almost climaxed at that moment. The legendary mage sat up and looked at Richard, actually asking, "Want more?" Richard flushed, but nodded. He was at his most energetic age right now, and even if the blessing of wisdom meant 1 year of development was equal to 3 for others, he was still only as mature as a 17 or 18-year-old. Having just become a man, and especially with a woman like Sharon who was second to none, it was obvious he would want more. "How many times do you want it?" The legendary mage began to laugh in a strange manner, the gentle woman from the night before seeming to be an illusion. Richard actually began to think this through earnestly. He still had no idea of the limits of his body, but there was something he was sure of. No matter how much it was, it would not be enough. He felt full of energy, like he could persist even if he had to get it up twice. His blood stirred, fully supportive of his fantasies and unworried of being sucked dry. 3 times, Richard hesitated, no. 5. Sharon suddenly burst into laughter, her right hand moving a few times and practically killing Richard, who was already at the edge. She then stood up, waved her hand to summon new underwear and robes before she began to dress. It's day, so you don't get any. A major disappointment. Richard silently stood up. He saw a full set of male clothing in the corner of the bedroom, and confirming with precision that they were measured out for him, walked over to wear them. Once clothed, Richard felt like the awkwardness and apprehension had diminished. Sharon was no longer the woman who made him go completely crazy last night, instead that legendary mage that he knew before. She looked completely normal, as if nothing had happened at all, leaving him unable to adjust to the situation. 2 very different Sharons matched up, leaving him unable to tell if the last night or this morning were dreams. Sharon looked at Richard and then walked to the French window, gazing at the majestic view of the sun rising from behind the distant Everwinter Mountains. Is there anything you want to say? Richard organized his feelings and forced himself to calm down. Why? Also, what do you need me to do in the future? Why? The legendary mage laughed melodiously, and then said with a shrug, what's there to ask? It's simple. I've been in a bad mood, so I took advantage of you. That's all there is. If you really want a reason, then it should be enough that you're tender and delicious. Seeing Richard turning slightly pale, Sharon could not resist the urge to laugh harder. It took her a while to continue. To be honest, there is a reason. My favorite hobby is to leave some trauma in every powerful being that could change the history of Norland in the future. But everyone's different, so I have to give them different psychological blows. I was thinking about you, and eventually decided that what I did last night was the best. I'd take your virginity. So from here on, whenever you find another woman, you won't be able to help but remember me. Ha ha. The legendary mage's expression and tone made her words seem true, and Richard was speechless. He had to repeat his second question once she was done. What do you need me to do, in the future? The future. Sharon suddenly went quiet. She sighed, stretching her left arm and pulling up the sleeve to reveal a tender forearm. Threads of blue mana began to appear on the snow-like skin. The deep blue aria is a grade 6 rune, and Norland right now has knowledge only up to grade 5. If you wish to complete it, you'll need to head to the depths of the boundless plains and look for its secrets. I will explore the plains, Richard said peacefully, not vowing or being hot-blooded. Then I'll be waiting for you. The dark blue rune slowly disappeared, and Sharon lifted her bright face, regaining her willful temperament. However, Richard now knew that the unrestrained, fearless legendary mage that everyone saw was not the true Sharon. The one wreathed in blue flames last midnight was truly her, or perhaps she was like him, one personality hidden so deeply nobody could find it. The skies brightened as the day of destiny came to a close. A lonely Richard left Sharon's residence, and as the magic gates behind him closed he couldn't help but halt his footsteps to turn back and take a look. Their worlds were separated once more. Who knew when he would be able to open these magic doors again? Sharon's last words were still ringing in his ears. You definitely can't let anyone know about last night. Of course he wouldn't do such a thing. This event, this experience, it was hidden deep inside his heart, stored carefully as the most valuable of treasures. It was the mage's other declaration that brought a slight smile to his frozen face. Sharon had succeeded in leaving behind a mark in his heart after taking his first time. She'd branded her own trauma into him, one that would be difficult to eliminate. Quite a radiant trauma, indeed. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., Please let us know report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 33. The Second Blow. Richard's life resumed as per usual after the day of destiny. He'd been at his limit already, so all he could do now was continue to persist with the day-to-day. He would surprise the Grand Mages again and again with each day, so much so that even knowing how mysterious the world truly was, they were surprised by how such a young body could be the most precise of machines. He worked with no emotions, no fluctuations, pushing on and on without tiring. The constant diligence brought forth an astounding amount of energy. The youth seemed to be improving so fast it astonished everyone. The only part of his growth that didn't seem to be taking a shortcut was his mana, which continued to creep up at a normal rate. Time should have flown by like water, but some little incidents disturbed the peace. Richard was determined to hide the events on the day of destiny deep in his heart, but it took less than a week for the legendary mage herself to blab about it, proudly emphasizing her evaluation of him being tender and delicious. Just like any other information, this spread quickly through the deep blue. Most men, and half as many women, remembered the name of Richard R. Sharon, feeling varying amounts of hatred and wishing they could have been the one in his place. While they couldn't actually beat Richard up, many loved doing that a few times a day in their minds. It gave them pleasure, sometimes a lot of pleasure. No matter how unthinkable this might seem, nobody had the courage to doubt Sharon. Not one person. The boss was the boss, and the person giving out gold was always right. This was the truth in the deep blue. With the cost of living here, anyone without Sharon's delight would have difficulty even surviving, and most people without the right to even obtain that bill every month had no right to say anything. It was the most effective of lines that separated the residents into the core of the deep blue and the others. Those who knew the deep blue well knew that this was not Sharon's intention. The legendary mage did as she liked, and wasn't proficient in managing societies. It was just that this structure had been formed naturally, and people got used to the hierarchy. Without it, many would be at a loss, and the silent mages who formed the foundation of the deep blue actually liked this lifestyle. The hierarchy of the deep blue was just like a feudal society. The residents paid taxes while the feudal lord took over responsibility for their protection. With war everywhere on the continent, being able to live under the wing of a legendary mage was blissful. The 17 grand mages gathered by the legendary mage's side could give her suggestions. However, unlike what many people thought, they were actually happy to see this. For them, the legendary mage's happiness in body and mind was the most important of all, and the only one who felt conflicted by the events was Blackgold. The Grey Dwarf's first response to Sharon's proclamation was elation. He felt like Her Excellency had been truly wise to use this method to show her delight. It had to be said that Richard was getting more and more delight lately, and it was growing heavy on his mind. Although it was nothing for the legendary mage's personal wallet, it was a huge amount for the deep blue. There did not seem to be a need to be too picky about this. The Grey Dwarf had believed resolutely that since Sharon was delighted both in mind and body, there was no need to express her delight in terms of gold. Richard's stipend should have dropped greatly. But that lucky Richard. The Grey Dwarf truly had to call Richard lucky. With the natural judgment of his race, he saw the boy's body strengthening by the day, mana flowing faintly as his bloodline began to reveal its true power. No matter how he looked at it, he couldn't see how Richard was tender and delicious. Blackgold was a special dwarf. He'd left behind the stubborn persistence that flowed in the blood of his species. Thus, since Richard had received such a special honor, he believed he wouldn't need to hold back when he bought the cheaper runes Richard made in the future. The boy's gift at runecrafting was increasingly shocking. He'd learnt the craft himself from his other studies, and his knowledge could even be considered expansive at this point. Once he began studying runes officially, the stability and precision of the complex spell formations he created was difficult for anyone to comprehend. They could only say this was enlightenment from the gods. All great beings, or those dedicated to helping them, possessed amazing foresight. While the Grand Mages were fixated on Richard's prospects, Blackgold was focused on the numerous runes he would create in the process. Because of the Day of Destiny, the Grey Dwarf dropped his pricing target for the runes by 40%. The profits at this price weren't too large, but compared to the general price on the continent, it was 70% cheaper. This was a way for him to try and console himself, even as he found himself being very generous. No matter what the price he bought it was, wouldn't it all go to Her Excellency in the end anyway? He was in an excellent mood the next few days. The Day of Destiny would reduce his expenses on one hand, and now he had a stream of revenue in the future. There could be nothing greater than that. However, those days came to a sudden halt when Sharon decided Richard's monthly allowance, the boy's stipend, did not drop at all. The Grey Dwarf had been left dazed for a long time. The increased revenue in the future still consoled him, but his price was dropped another 10%. The news rippled out in all directions, like the splash of a pebble falling in a lake. Anyone sensitive to information could judge just how far they were from the core based on how long it took them to receive this news. Stephen was one such sensitive person. He didn't receive the news too early or too late, but it was definitely later than he had expected. However, he didn't have the energy to feel angry over his position in the Deep Blue. The news itself was so shocking he could never imagine it. After obtaining the news, Stephen appeared to be calm. At the very least, there were no other sounds in his residence. He stood in front of the magic mirror naked, and stared at himself for a whole 2 hours. Minnie stood by the French window behind him, unmoving as though she was a lifeless statue. It was still snowing outside, and it felt like the weather had never improved from the day they'd returned from the testing area. While Flo Bay's springs often had snow, it had never been so heavy and lasted for so long as it had this year. The residents had always been completely isolated from the callous world outside. Even if one opened the window, the magic barrier would be able to block the chill and haze, but now the stifling gray from the outside seemed to pass through the window and extend into the residence. The air seemed stiff, the dark gray mist so heavy it left one feeling suffocated. Minnie subconsciously hugged herself tighter, feeling like her frail body under these magic robes could not take on the ravaging of the storm. Flo Bay was magnificent, but it was not friendly. Before the blizzard revealed its wrath, there was normally an exceeding calm just like now. The residence was deathly still. Stephen's residence was very, very large. The space was beautiful, and was a representation of his status and power. In the past she had been intoxicated by this beauty, but now it felt like this place was far too big. It left her uneasy as the two of them stood in this huge space, feeling both the unknown chill as well as the terror of being about to get lost. Minnie had the urge to escape, but she bit her lips hard and did not allow any movement or sound to escape her. She knew that the longer the silence was, the more terrifying the blizzard would be when it arrived. Stephen had already stood there silently for 2 hours, and who knew how much longer this would last? With only the two of them in this large residence, she would be the person he'd vent on. She'd be the target when the blizzard hit. Stephen finally started moving. He showed off each muscle of his body in front of the mirror, his dragon blood and powerful physique making him far sturdier than the normal mage. The young but mature man in the mirror was tall and strong, with no traces of excess flesh. The proportions of his limbs could be called perfect, and he could be proud of this body that was a personification of male beauty. The dragon bloodline seemed like a dark red mist in the magic mirror, circulating around the surface of his body to give him even greater charm. Judging himself objectively, Stephen could naturally come up with a few evaluations. Most were praises he'd received 2 years ago, when he'd just turned 15 and truly stepped into the world of nobles. He could definitely be proud of his body and appearance. Unlike that damned Richard who still exuded a juvenile aura due to his age, he had true masculine charm. There was no lack of words like handsome, determined, sturdy, and powerful in the evaluations Stephen had of himself, but there were some things missing. He turned his head and then asked with an eerie voice, "What does tender and delicious mean?" Minnie's body trembled without permission. The blizzard had arrived. She lowered her head without saying a word. Anything she said at this moment would be like dripping fresh blood in front of a ravenous wolf. It would only make him more brutal. Bang! The skin on Stephen's right hand was sliced open as he punched the magic mirror, blood spurting out from a dozen spots before dripping to the ground. He didn't seem to sense the pain, however, instead turning and staring at Minnie with bloodshot eyes as he yelled with all the strength in his body, "I'm asking you, what does tender and delicious mean? If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 34. The Sediments of Memories. Minnie was sent flying into the French window, crashing hard into it with a dull thud. The classically fired Danube glass showed why it was worth 1,000 gold every square meter, not jolting in the slightest as if a worm had crashed into it instead. Minnie was like a lifeless cloth doll, bouncing back from the impact as she fell to the ground forehead first. She lay there unmoving, a stream of blood gushing from her long hair that seemed to wriggle and squirm on the shiny obsidian floor like a strange being. It took her a moment to move, her hands groping around her before she pushed herself up with difficulty. Blood continued to flow from the sides of her hair, dyeing one side of her cheeks red and sticking her hair to her face. It wasn't just the forehead, the corners of her lips and nostrils were also spurting blood, and Minnie touched her face to feel the warmth. Seeing her hand covered in red, she rubbed it hard on her clothes, before she tore off a corner of her skirt to clean up her face. She then bunched up her hair and tied it using that very blood-stained cloth, swaying as she stood up. Stephen remained where he was, his chest heaving as the wisps of blood in his eyes did not seem to dim at all. His muscles twitched under his skin, and his tightly clenched fists occasionally caused crisp, cracking sounds. Dragon warlocks had powerful physiques, and while not comparable to true warriors, they were far stronger than normal mages. An attack made in the midst of absolute fury would be powerful. Minnie swayed as she walked towards Stephen, closing her eyes to await the next painful blow. Her long white dress had large bloodstains on it, and half her face had swelled up. Still her expression remained peaceful, and she still didn't make a sound. Crying or begging would only net her a more powerful beating. The corner of Stephen's eye twitched. He suddenly grabbed the collar of her dress and gave a powerful tug, splitting its upper half into two. He then pulled away her undergarments, revealing her naked upper body. However, what he saw was not a naked body that could excite him. On the original pale skin that exquisitely radiated her youth were bruises of all sizes. It made for a shocking sight, like a carved jade vase that had been smashed until there were cracks everywhere. The youth took a deep breath and closed his eyes. It took a few minutes of silence for him to calm down completely, but other than the wisps of blood in his eyes that wouldn't disappear so soon, everything went back to normal. He told Minnie, "Don't go to class for a few days, and rest and recover here. I'll have a cleric come and take care of the injuries to your face." He paused and began to pace around in the room. After doing dozens of rounds, he suddenly stopped. He waved his fist around, as if that would help make up his mind. It's time to resolve everything. The situation really can't be saved at this rate. Once you've dealt with the injuries to your face, go look for Aaron, you know what to do. It's about time that girl was of some use. Minnie nodded silently, and after seeing him wave his fist and indicating he had nothing left to say, she dragged her heavy body along, doing her best to maintain her stability. She entered the bathroom and began to wash the blood off, while Stephen dressed himself neatly and twisted a large ruby ring on his finger. The ruby emitted a dazzling ray of light and immediately dimmed, magic taking its message through layers of obstruction to be transmitted to every corner of the deep blue. It took but a moment for two capable men to arrive before Stephen. One was a warrior, while the other was a cleric. The two listened carefully to Stephen's instructions, and the warrior left immediately while the cleric stayed to treat Minnie. The cleric crossed his arms in front of his chest in prayer, beginning a chant that caused a pure white light to pour out of his hands and splash on Minnie's head like water. The light flowed along her skin, causing wounds to close at a speed the naked eye could see everywhere it went. The bruises dissipated and the swelling went down slightly. Although Minnie's injuries looked frightening, they were only superficial. There was no need for a greater heal to be cast on her, but since Stephen was extremely impatient for her to recover, the cleric didn't mind putting in the effort to cast 3 such heals on her. Once the treatment was done, Minnie was left with slight traces of injuries at the corner of her forehead. Knowing what she had to do, she did not linger or rest, instead wearing her robes and leaving the residence immediately. The fatigued cleric left silently as well, leaving Stephen alone in the residence. He seemed to pace back and forth in worry, taking a few looks outside the window on occasion and cursing the wretched weather. Finally, the warrior hastened back to stand behind Stephen, whispering, "Everything's been prepared. How should we do it?" Stephen gritted his teeth, raised his arm and slashed down towards the front. He answered in a deep voice, "Do what you can." The warrior trembled, and a ruthless look appeared on his face before he left quietly. Many fates had been changed on the day of destiny, but Richard continued to work hard for the sake of the future. His progress towards the peak was just like how he climbed the rocky slopes in his youth, having to be done step by step. Every early morning, every late night, it was all a tiny step towards his goals. Deep in the night, Richard walked towards his residence, filled with satisfaction and tiredness from a day's work. However, just as the heavy metal gate to his residence was in sight, he suddenly heard crying and sounds of abuse in the depths of the alley nearby. The voice sounded slightly familiar, and precision immediately told him that it was Aaron's. Aaron. It was a name that had practically disappeared from his life, but now it had come up once more. It sounded like she was in trouble, something Richard found rather strange. Who would dare cause trouble here? Then again, the surrounding area was extremely quiet and the magic lamps used to illuminate the public regions were soft and dim. On the other hand, every residence here other than Richard's own had grand mages staying within, or children of nobles or even the emperor. The security was tight, and there were magic eyes everywhere without any areas being neglected. If anyone wanted to kick up a fuss, they would find numerous enforcers surrounding them out of nowhere. The sounds of crying came from an alley at the side that was rather deep, and came from a bend, which meant Richard could not see what was going on. He frowned and immediately walked quickly towards the alley, turning the corner to see the source of the ruckus. It was indeed Aaron, being accosted by three men with obvious malicious intent. Right behind the girl was an extremely tall and sturdy man, his body so big it was equivalent to three young ladies stacked up. His bulky hand was gripping the girl's wrists, practically lifting her off the ground. Another tall man, this one skinny, was standing at the side with his arms crossed, his gaze wandering up and down Aaron's body while lingering at her chest and abdomen. At the front of her was a fierce fellow who was groping her. It seemed like he was searching her body for something, but his hands didn't leave the sensitive regions at all. Aaron could only kick around in her attempt to struggle free, but the man grabbed her thigh and clasped it under his armpit. His hands began to wander up her legs as he chuckled, "I almost forgot. There's a place here that can hide a lot of money. Come, let's see how much gold you've got hidden there that has you so nervous. Let me go. I'll return the money. It's not time yet." Aaron shrieked, but the sturdy man behind her used his left hand and cupped her mouth, stopping the girl's screams. The man in front of her seemed to have no intentions of stopping and wanted to continue searching all the way. His smile was even more lewd now. "It's not time, but it's just a few more days. We want to retrieve our interest in advance now. If you really have no money, then sleep with us for a few nights to repay your debt. It's not as if you've never earned money from a man's body before." The three men's attention was entirely on Aaron, until they suddenly felt a boiling hot heat wave surge over, blocking the area around them well. Next came Richard's voice, "Let go of her." The man in front of Aaron halted his movements but did not let go. He stared at the emblem on Richard's collar hesitantly, finding it difficult to ascertain Richard's identity. However, the fireball leaping up and down at Richard's right hand was scaring them witless. A mage, and one so young at that, appearing in such a luxurious region, was, at the very least, an enforcer. For people like them who lived at the borders, enforcers were basically gods who could not be crossed. Richard furrowed his brows. These three men were obviously not residents in the area, and did not even seem to be official residents of Deep Blue's towers. Otherwise, they definitely would have understood the significance of his emblem. The men saw Richard's expression and immediately retrieved their hands, and summoned the courage to ask, "May I know who?" "Richard." "Richard R. Sharon." The three men were obviously startled, and they immediately became deferential. All who lived by the borders knew the names of the legendary mage's pupils and the grand mages. This was the minimum requirement for survival. In this region, they did not even dare have thoughts of doing evil. Everyone knew that there were magic eyes everywhere monitoring the area. This was a public warning to prevent the impetuous and ignorant people from harming the residents in the luxurious areas. This was because these residences included not just powerful mages, but children of aristocracy who were not all that powerful as well. The three men immediately let Aaron go, and the girl darted behind Richard like a frightened rabbit, trembling hands grabbing onto his robes. The leader glared at Aaron, and then smiled as if fawning on Richard. "Lord Richard, this woman owes us a lot of money, and because she can't repay us she's hidden inside the Deep Blue and is unwilling to come out. We've only come to the Deep Blue because we have no other choice. Look, we've come all the way and found her, but she still won't return us the money." "But there's 3 more days," Aaron shouted from behind Richard. "If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 35. Assassination. The man glared at Aaron immediately, saying in a self-righteous manner, "But this isn't the first time you've stalled. The Deep Blue's laws allow me to ask you to return the money immediately. If you don't want to, you can come with me and work to pay off your debt, or scram." The man then turned towards Richard, his expression shifting to a smile so fast it was like magic. "Lord Richard, we probably shouldn't have appeared here, but we're acting according to the laws of the Deep Blue, which we wouldn't dare to ignore. Her Excellency once said contracts must not be blasphemed, and this woman hasn't returned the debt or even paid interest. She doesn't even provide services as per the law. Don't be taken in by her pitiful appearance." Although he seemed extremely respectful, the man's words revealed his unyielding nature. Although the Deep Blue did not have many laws, those that were in place were as strong as steel. Even grand mages didn't have the right to break them, forget someone like Richard. Richard furrowed his brows and turned to look at Aaron, seeing the terror and recoil in her eyes. She didn't even dare to meet his gaze. He balled his hand up, and the fireball floated several meters into the sky before dissipating into a small explosion. Such exquisite control over magic immediately caused the three men to have a change in expression, and they couldn't help but take several steps backwards. While what they were doing was reasonable, given the difference in their positions, if Richard injured or disabled them in a bad mood, the most they would get was gold in compensation. Richard's eyes swept over them. "I'll repay her debts on her behalf. Now scram." But the man in charge was obviously unwilling, secretly peeping at Aaron, who was hiding behind Richard.